She hadn't spoken in 3 years. Not one word. Not a whisper. Not even her father's name. The doctors called it selective mutism triggered by acute trauma. Adrian Hale called it the worst kind of punishment a man could receive, watching his daughter disappear inside herself while he stood outside the glass, helpless, with all his billions and none of his answers. But on a rain-soaked Tuesday night in Seattle, inside a hidden alcove beneath a service staircase, an exhausted construction worker with cracked hands and unpaid bills knelt down beside a trembling 6-year-old girl and said 7 words that broke 3 years of silence wide open. This is that story. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain started around 4 in the afternoon, the way Seattle rain always did in November. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just relentless. A slow, gray suffocation that settled over the city like a second skin and refused to lift. Adrian Hale stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his 43rd floor office and watched the water streak down the glass in crooked lines. Behind him, 3 executives from Meridian Pacific Freight were still talking. He could hear their voices, something about port fees, something about renegotiating the Anchorage contract, but the words had stopped reaching him about 6 minutes ago. "Mr. Hale." He didn't turn around. "Mr. Hale, if we could just get your sign-off on the restructuring terms before the gala tonight, send it to Marcus." His voice came out flat. Not rude exactly, just empty. "He'll review it." A pause. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped. "Of course. We'll coordinate with Marcus." He heard them gather their things. He heard the soft click of the office door. And then there was just the rain, and the gray city below, and the faint reflection of his own face in the glass. Sharp jaw, dark circles under darker eyes. A man who looked like he was winning at everything and felt like he was losing at something he couldn't name. His phone buzzed on the desk. He already knew who it was before he looked. Mrs. Delgado. "Emma had another episode during art therapy. Dr. Samuels thinks we should discuss adjusting the schedule. Call when you can." Adrian set the phone face down on the desk and pressed both hands flat against the surface. He stood like that for a moment, jaw tight, breathing through his nose. Emma, 6 years old, brown hair that went wild in humidity. A gap between her 2 front teeth that she'd gotten from him, according to her mother, though Adrian had never been able to see it. She had a way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard, this slow, bird-like angle that could still stop him cold in the middle of a boardroom presentation if he thought about it at the wrong moment. She hadn't spoken in 3 years, 1 month, and 11 days. He knew the count the way you know the number of steps in your own house in the dark. Automatically, without trying, without wanting to. The accident happened on a Thursday evening in October 3 years back. Adrian had been in Singapore closing a deal that added $62 million to his net worth. He remembered the exact number because he was reading the final confirmation on his phone when his assistant, pale-faced and barely holding herself together, walked into the hotel conference room and asked everyone else to leave. Sarah had been driving home from Emma's violin recital. Highway 2, northbound, wet roads. A truck carrying logging equipment blew a rear tire at 60 miles an hour and jackknifed across 3 lanes. Sarah died at the scene. Emma survived, physically unharmed, which was the word the hospital used, physically unharmed, a phrase that Adrian grew to hate with a particular intensity because it implied that harm was only the kind you could photograph on an X-ray. For 2 weeks after the crash, Emma cried. She cried the way children cry when they don't understand what forever means yet. Loudly, desperately, with her whole body. And then she stopped. Not just crying, everything. She stopped talking. She stopped responding to her name. She sat in rooms and stared at walls and moved when you moved her and ate when food was placed in front of her. But she was gone somewhere inside herself. Somewhere the therapists couldn't follow with their soft voices and their picture cards and their carefully structured play sessions. Dr. Renata Samuels was the 4th specialist Adrian had hired. She came with credentials that filled 2 pages and a reputation that 3 different child psychologists had called the best in the Pacific Northwest. She was kind, she was patient, she was thorough, and after 18 months of twice-weekly sessions, she had made progress that she described as meaningful but nonlinear. Emma had learned to point at things she wanted. She had learned to nod and shake her head. She had learned to take Dr. Samuel's hand when she was frightened instead of simply freezing in place, but she had not spoken. Not one word. Not to Dr. Samuels, not to Mrs. Delgado, the housekeeper who had been with the Hale household for 9 years, and who Emma had once adored. Not to the tutor Adrian hired, or the music therapist, or the art therapist, or the woman who came twice a week specifically to work on animal-assisted communication with a golden retriever named Biscuit. Not to Adrian. That last one was the thing he couldn't say out loud. He couldn't say it to Dr. Samuels, or his assistant Marcus, or his brother Cole, who called from Portland every Sunday with the exhausting optimism of someone who didn't have to live inside the silence. His own daughter looked at him sometimes with an expression he couldn't fully read, something between recognition and distance, like looking at a photograph of someone you used to know. And he sat with that every night in the kitchen after Mrs. Delgado went home, drinking coffee he didn't taste and scrolling through emails he didn't process. He had built a shipping empire from a single inherited dock and 23 years of relentless, occasionally ruthless work. He had negotiated contracts that made grown men flinch. He had fired people who needed firing and hired people who needed hiring and made decisions at 3 a.m. that lesser people couldn't make at noon with a full team behind them. He could not fix his daughter. He had tried money. The best doctors, the best therapists, the best private school with a specialized program for children with trauma-related conditions. He had installed a custom sensory room in the mansion with weighted blankets and dim lighting and soft textures on every surface because Dr. Samuels said Emma needed a safe space. Emma sat in the sensory room sometimes and stared at the ceiling. She sat in a lot of places and stared at things. Adrian Hale, who had solved every problem money could reach, was standing at the absolute border of what money could reach. And on the other side of that border was just a 6-year-old girl who had been alone in a wrecked car in the rain for 2 hours on the worst night of her life. And whatever had happened to her in those 2 hours, whatever she had seen, whatever she had held on to, she had locked it inside herself and swallowed the key. He didn't know about the voice she remembered. He didn't know about the 7 words. Not yet. The Grand Crescent Hotel occupied an entire block of First Avenue, a building that had been Seattle landmark since 1923 and had been restored 3 times since then, each restoration adding another layer of gilded ambition to its bones. The ballroom on the 3rd floor could seat 600 people and had hosted everything from governors' inaugurations to film premieres to, on one notable occasion in 2019, a tech billionaire's wedding that reportedly cost more than the original construction of the building. Tonight it was hosting the Hale Maritime Foundation's annual charity gala, the 4th annual, though this year felt different in a way that Adrian couldn't entirely articulate. More cameras, more pressure. The foundation had pledged commitments this year that were going to require him to be entirely present, entirely charming, entirely the version of himself that belonged in rooms like this. He was not, at the moment, any of those things. His driver, a quiet man named Gerald, who had been with him for 7 years and who had the rare gift of knowing when not to speak, pulled the town car up to the hotel's side entrance at 6:47. The gala started at 7. Adrian had allowed himself exactly no buffer. "Emma's with Mrs. Delgado tonight?" Gerald asked, not turning around, watching the mirrors. "She's here, actually." Adrian pulled at his cufflink. "Mrs. Delgado brings her for the first hour. There's a quiet room set up backstage. Dr. Samuels said limited social exposure in controlled environments." Gerald nodded slowly. "How's she doing?" Adrian looked out the window. "She had an episode during art therapy today." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. She's fine. She's always fine after." He said it quickly, automatically, and heard the falseness in his own voice. Gerald didn't respond to it, which meant Gerald heard it too. The car stopped. A hotel employee opened the door. Adrian straightened his jacket, arranged his face into the expression that boardrooms and ballrooms expected from him, and stepped out into the cold November air. Inside the hotel, the organized chaos of pre-event preparation was in full swing. The ballroom crew was doing final sound checks. The catering staff was moving in tight formations between the kitchen and the serving stations. And everywhere Adrian walked, people either froze slightly or sped up, depending on their position and their history with him. His reputation preceded him in most rooms. In this hotel, tonight, it arrived approximately 30 seconds before he did. Marcus Reyes, his chief of staff and the closest thing Adrian had to a functional work wife, materialized at his elbow within 40 seconds of his arrival. Marcus was 35, methodical, and one of the very few people on Earth who could hand Adrian a problem and have it received without visible hostility. "Ballroom's looking good," Marcus said, matching his pace. Catering confirmed all the dietary restrictions. The AV setup is done, and Senator Cartwright's office confirmed he'll make remarks around 8:30. "The construction crew clear?" Adrian asked. "Almost. The restoration team has about 3 more hours of work on the east corridor ceiling. They're running behind, but they've been routed away from the main guest areas. You won't see them." Adrian nodded. He noticed peripherally a group of workers in worn work clothes moving equipment through a service corridor. A woman carrying a toolbox, a man pushing a cart stacked with scaffolding components. He registered them the way he registered most background elements of his life: present, functional, not his problem. He didn't look twice at the woman. He should have. He would think about that later. The quiet room backstage was not really quiet. It was quieter than the ballroom, which from backstage was a constant low thunder of sound and light leaking under doors and through the gaps in the temporary walls. But quiet, by the definition of what Emma needed, it was not. Mrs. Delgado had arranged it as well as she could. Emma's weighted blanket folded over a chair, her small backpack with her drawing notebooks, a pair of noise-canceling headphones that she wore around her neck like a piece of armor she might need at a moment's notice. The room had a couch, a folding table, and a door that locked from the inside, which Mrs. Delgado had confirmed 3 times with the hotel coordinator because it was the detail that mattered most. Emma sat on the couch in her dark blue dress. She had chosen it herself, which Mrs. Delgado had reported to Adrian as progress, though Adrian wasn't sure choosing your own dress counted as the kind of progress they were all supposed to be hoping for. And she drew in her notebook. She drew constantly. Pages and pages of things that Dr. Samuels said were important to document, but never pressed Emma to explain. Mostly she drew landscapes, skies with specific configurations of stars, sometimes water, sometimes a shape that might be a car or might be a box. And Dr. Samuels had thoughts about that shape that she shared with Adrian carefully, in a tone that tried not to alarm him. Tonight she drew a sky full of stars over what looked like a road. The noise from the ballroom was getting louder. The catering staff had propped open a service door somewhere, and now the full assault of the pre-gala sound check. A microphone feedback screech, then a bass line that rattled the folding table, came flooding into the backstage area. Mrs. Delgado looked up from her phone and saw Emma's shoulders rise. "It's okay, mija, just the music. You remember the headphones?" But Emma was already off the couch, already moving, the way she moved when the sound got too big. Fast and silent and purposeful in a direction that was simply away, away from the noise, away from the light, away from everything that was pressing in too hard. "Emma. Emma, wait." The service corridor was poorly lit and ran in 2 directions from the backstage room. Emma took the left turn. Mrs. Delgado took 3 steps after her before the hotel coordinator appeared in the doorway, needing a signature on something, and in those 3 seconds of distraction, Emma turned another corner and disappeared. Olivia Carter had been on her feet for 11 hours. That wasn't unusual. The 11-hour days were the rule, not the exception, had been for the past 2 years since she'd taken on any restoration job that would hire her and learned to stop counting the hours because counting made it worse. What was unusual about tonight was that her back was sending her a specific and detailed message about the scaffolding incident at 2 o'clock. A slip? Nothing serious. Nothing that would show up anywhere because she couldn't afford for it to show up anywhere. And her left shoulder was doing the thing it did when she'd been carrying weight wrong all day. She'd earned the right to sit down for 5 minutes. That was the only reason she turned down the service corridor instead of heading back to where Martinez and the rest of the crew were finishing the east corridor work. Not curiosity, not anything meaningful. Just a body that needed 5 minutes of stillness in a quiet place before she could give it another 3 hours of work. The alcove under the backstage staircase was small. Not even a room, really, just a triangular space where the underside of the stairs created a low ceiling and the service pipes ran along the back wall. There was a utility shelf bolted to one wall with some abandoned cleaning supplies on it, and the floor was concrete, but it was away from the noise and away from the light, and away from Martinez's running commentary about the hotel management's incompetence. which she loved like a brother but could not listen to for one more hour. Olivia set her toolbox down, lowered herself to sit on it, a habit when chairs weren't available, and rolled her neck until something in it cracked in a way that was unpleasant but necessary. She almost didn't see the girl. The alcove was dim. The girl was wearing a dark blue dress and sitting pressed into the corner where the staircase wall met the back wall, knees pulled to her chest, and she had made herself as small as possible in the way that children do when they are trying to disappear. If Olivia hadn't glanced to her left as she was sitting down, she would have missed her entirely. She went very still. The girl's breathing was audible, fast, shallow, the kind that was chasing itself. Her eyes were open but not focused, staring at some middle distance that wasn't the wall and wasn't the room and wasn't anything in the alcove. Her hands were pressed flat against her knees, and her knuckles were pale. Olivia had seen this before. She had seen it in highway medians and kitchen floors and the back of ambulances, and once in the wreckage of a car on a mountain highway in the rain. She knew what it looked like when a person, regardless of age, regardless of size, was somewhere else entirely, somewhere terrible, somewhere they couldn't get out of on their own. She did not reach for her phone. She did not stand up quickly. She did not say hello or are you okay or sweetheart, where's your mommy? All the things that people said to frighten children because the words were what came naturally when what was actually needed was something else entirely. Instead, she stayed where she was. She set her toolbox carefully, slowly, without a sound. She turned so she was angled slightly away from the girl, not threatening, not approaching, not demanding to be seen, and she waited. 30 seconds. Maybe 40. The girl's breathing didn't slow, but it changed. Slightly less frantic. The tiniest adjustment, the way a wild thing adjusts when it realizes the nearby presence isn't lunging. Olivia looked at the underside of the staircase above them. The paint was original, probably from the last restoration in the 80s. She could tell by the brush marks. Underneath it, she could see where someone had scratched initials into the wood before the paint went on. JM plus RT, 1961. Somebody fell in love under these stairs, she said, quietly. Not to the girl exactly, just into the air between them. 60-some years ago, they left their initials up there, JM and RT. The girl didn't respond, but the breathing shifted again. I wonder if they knew, Olivia continued, the same quiet tone, that someone would be sitting under here looking at their initials in 2024. Probably not. People don't usually think about that. They're in the moment. This dark little corner, and they scratch their names because that's the only way to say we were here. Silence. The bass line from the ballroom pulsed distantly, a heartbeat 2 rooms away. Olivia looked at the girl then, slowly, without making it a confrontation. The girl's eyes had moved. Not to Olivia, not quite, but to the general space where Olivia's voice was coming from. The knuckles were less pale. The noise is really bad out there, Olivia said. I work construction. You'd think I'd be used to loud, but there's a difference between loud you can do something about and loud that just happens to you. She paused. You know the difference. The girl's eyes moved again, still not meeting Olivia's, but closer. The breathing was still fast, but no longer chasing itself. Olivia had been carrying, somewhere in the back of her chest, a specific weight for 3 years. Not the grief. Grief was a different shape, rounder, older. This was something smaller and sharper. A thing she had told herself didn't matter and had never quite convinced herself was true. She had never told anyone the words she'd used. In the hospital debrief, in the statement she gave the investigators, in the 3 different conversations she'd had with trauma counselors in the weeks after. None of them had asked, specifically, what she'd said to the child in the back of the car. They'd asked about vital signs, about positioning, about the timeline of the rescue operation. Nobody asked what she'd said when it was just the 2 of them in the dark, and the rain, and the silence. She hadn't planned to say it again. She hadn't thought about it well, that wasn't entirely true. But she said it now because this child's breathing was still wrong, and the noise was still coming through the walls, and something in the particular quality of this small, frightened person's stillness had reached into Olivia's chest and pressed on the weight that lived there. The storm always passes, little bird. Her voice was low and even. Just look at the stars. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had texture. The girl had gone completely still. Not the frozen stillness of panic, but something else. Something that Olivia, who had spent years learning the difference between kinds of stillness, recognized as the stillness of recognition. The stillness of a word in a language you thought you'd forgotten and then heard again unexpectedly. The girl's eyes found Olivia's face, really found it. For the first time, directly, a gaze with actual weight behind it. And Olivia felt, in the center of her sternum, something she had not felt in 3 years, which was the particular sensation of a moment that is about to change shape. Adrian was looking for Emma. He'd been looking for 4 minutes, which was long enough for his characteristic composure to develop its first visible cracks. Marcus was with him, and 2 members of the hotel's event staff, and Mrs. Delgado, who was apologizing in a low, devastated voice that Adrian had already told her once to stop because it wasn't helping anyone. The service corridor ran in 2 directions from the backstage room. "She goes away from noise," Adrian said. His voice controlled the way voices get controlled when the person using them is genuinely frightened. "She always goes away from noise. Which direction is quieter?" One of the hotel staff pointed left. Adrian went left. The first 2 doors were supply closets, locked. The third was a utility room, empty. He turned another corner, scanning, and saw the dim triangle of space under the staircase. He almost walked past it. He turned back because he saw, in the furthest shadow of the alcove, the small dark shape of a navy blue dress. He stepped forward and then stopped completely, because sitting beside his daughter, not touching her, not crowding her, just present, in a way that seemed almost carefully calibrated, was a woman in a worn canvas work jacket with dust on her shoulder and a streak of paint on her forearm, and the kind of face that had been through enough that it didn't need to perform concern. She was just sitting there, and Emma was looking at her, which was already more than he expected. But the thing that stopped the air in Adrian's lungs was the position of his daughter's body. Emma's shoulders were down. Emma's hands were loose in her lap. Emma, who had been in sensory overload 40 minutes ago, who had bolted from a backstage room in a state of acute panic, who required 45 minutes and a specific routine just to transition between environments without distress. Emma was sitting with her knees no longer pulled to her chest, and she was looking at this stranger, and her breathing was slow. Adrian had not seen his daughter breathe that slowly in a place that wasn't her own bedroom in 3 years. He stood in the entrance to the alcove and he did not move, because something in the scene, something in the particular quality of the stillness between his daughter and this woman, told him, with a conviction he couldn't have explained in any boardroom, that breaking it would be wrong. The woman looked up. She saw him. Her expression went through something: recognition, calculation, then a decision. She kept her voice at the same low register. She needed somewhere quiet, she said. Not defensive, just factual. "I can see that," Adrian said, equally low. He looked at Emma. Emma was still looking at the woman. And then, 31 months. 31 months since the last word. He had stopped counting when it passed 2 years because Dr. Samuels said counting was a form of attachment to an outcome that would prevent him from accepting the process. And he had tried. He had genuinely tried to stop, but his brain had kept the number anyway, quietly, like a wound that wouldn't quite close. Emma's lips moved. Adrian's chest seized. Her voice was barely a sound, rough from disuse, thin as paper, so quiet that he leaned forward without meaning to, the way you lean toward something you're afraid is a hallucination. "Say it again." The 3 words fell into the alcove like stones into still water. The woman went very still. Adrian pressed one hand against the doorframe. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Emma's eyes were still on the woman's face, and there was something in his daughter's expression that Adrian had not seen in 31 months. Not hope exactly. Nothing so clean or legible as that. More like the expression of someone who has been carrying a locked door inside them and has just heard, from the other side of it, a sound they recognize. The woman looked at Emma, then she looked at Adrian. A brief, complicated glance that held something he couldn't quite parse. Then she looked back at Emma, and very quietly, she said it again. "The storm always passes, little bird. Just look at the stars." Emma closed her eyes. One tear ran down her left cheek, just one, and then she exhaled. A long, shaking, full-body exhale, The kind that a person makes when they have been holding their breath for a very long time, for so long they stopped noticing they were holding it. And she leaned slightly toward the woman's shoulder, not touching, just near. Adrian Hale, who had not cried in public since his wife's funeral and had not cried in private in longer than that, pressed his knuckle against his mouth and looked at the ceiling of the service corridor and breathed through his nose until the sensation passed. When he looked back, the woman's eyes were wet too, but her face was complicated. Not just moved, something else underneath it. Something that looked, to Adrian's admittedly limited ability to read strangers, a lot like someone reckoning with something they'd been carrying alone. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know the shape of the thing that had just happened here, in this forgotten triangle of space under a staircase in a hotel that charged $400 a plate for a charity dinner while this woman sat on a toolbox in a paint-stained jacket and gave his daughter back the ability to ask for something. He would find out. That part, at least, he knew how to do. The gala happened without him. Marcus handled it, ran the event with the seamless efficiency that justified his salary and then some, gave Adrian's opening remarks from the notes they'd prepared, fielded Senator Cartwright with practiced grace. Guests noticed Adrian's absence in the way that guests notice these things. Whispers, glances, the mild social disruption of a host who doesn't appear. But Marcus managed it, and the checks got written, and by all practical measures, the evening was a success. Adrian didn't know any of that until the next morning. What he knew that evening was this. When he stepped into the alcove, the woman stood up. She did it quickly. Too quickly. A reflex. The movement of someone who has learned to make themselves small in spaces where they feel suddenly visible. She picked up the toolbox in one motion, nodded at Emma, not at him, at Emma, a small and deliberate acknowledgement, and moved toward the corridor. "Wait," Adrian said. She paused, didn't quite turn back. I want to know your name." He heard how it came out, more demand than request, which was a lifelong habit he'd been trying and largely failing to break. He tried again. "Please." She looked at him over her shoulder, brown eyes, tired, not unfriendly but not warm either, the eyes of someone who had learned to assess situations quickly. "Carter," she said. "Olivia Carter." "You're with the construction crew?" "Restoration." A small correction, but she made it. "Miss Carter, I should get back." She was already half turned. "My crew's waiting." "Emma asked you to repeat something," Adrian said. "Those words. She recognized them. I need to understand why." Something shifted in Olivia Carter's face. He caught it, a tightening, a decision being made, and then the decision came down on the side of retreat. "I couldn't tell you," she said, and she was already walking. He let her go. He had no choice. Emma was still in the alcove, and Emma's moment of openness was a thing he was terrified of disrupting. He went back to his daughter, crouched down in front of her, and found Emma looking at the space where the woman had been. "She had to go do her work," he said carefully. She was working nearby." Emma looked at him. Not the photograph of a stranger look, an actual look, present and direct, the kind of look that hit him in the chest every time because he'd stopped expecting it. She reached out and touched his hand. That was all. Just touched it, briefly, and then pulled her hand back to her lap. Adrian sat on the concrete floor of the service corridor in his $5,000 suit and held the feeling of that 2-second touch like it was a piece of glass he was afraid to breathe on. "Boss," said I. He found Olivia Carter's employment information through the hotel's contractor records. It took Marcus 40 minutes, which meant Adrian sat with the not knowing for 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes longer than he was accustomed to sitting with anything. The name of the company was Strand Restoration. A small outfit, 4 full-time employees and a rotating cast of day laborers, the kind of company that existed in the gap between the work that was glamorous and the work that needed doing. Their bid for the Grand Crescent corridor work had come in significantly lower than the other 3 contractors, which was why they'd gotten the job. Olivia Carter, according to the hotel's records, was their lead restoration specialist, which told Adrian roughly nothing about who she was or what she knew or what lived behind those tired brown eyes. He had Marcus run a full background. He wasn't proud of that. He told himself he'd have done it for anyone whose inexplicable connection to his daughter demanded explanation, which was true technically, but didn't entirely justify it, which he also knew. What came back surprised him. Not the financial picture, though that surprised him too, the debt load and the bank communications, and the overdue notices that painted the portrait of someone barely keeping the surface above water. What surprised him was the career history. Olivia Carter, 30 years old, had spent 4 years as a paramedic with the Seattle Fire Department. She had a performance record that her supervisor had described in a reference that was part of the file as exceptional under pressure, specific gift for pediatric trauma situations. She had resigned 18 months after her husband's death. The resignation letter, bland and brief, cited personal reasons. But it was the incident records that stopped Adrienne cold. 3 years ago, October 14th, Highway 2, northbound, a multi-vehicle collision involving a logging truck with a blown tire. Fatalities, 2. Injuries, 6. First responder on scene, Olivia Carter, Paramedic Unit 7. Adrienne read the report twice. Then he set down his phone and sat in his office in the dark for 20 minutes. She had been there. She had been there. The first person on scene, the first person into the wrecked SUV, the person who had, the report mentioned it, clinical and brief. Responder remained with juvenile survivor in rear vehicle compartment for 114 minutes, pending extrication equipment arrival. 114 minutes. Almost 2 hours. 2 hours in the wreckage of the car that had killed his wife with his 6-year-old daughter. And he had never known her name. Adrienne stood up, picked up his car keys, and drove to the address in the contractor file. It was past 11 o'clock. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, reflecting the streetlights in long orange smears. The apartment building on 43rd was the kind of building that had good bones and bad everything else. The lobby door buzzer worked only if you held it for 3 full seconds, and the elevator was out of service. And the hallway carpet on the 3rd floor was the particular gray of something that had been washed one too many times and given up. He knocked on apartment 3F. He heard movement inside. A pause. The specific silence of someone who wasn't expecting company deciding whether to answer. The door opened on a chain. Olivia Carter looked at him through the gap. She had changed out of her work jacket. She was wearing a gray pullover with a fraying cuff, and her hair was down, which made her look younger and somehow more guarded at the same time. She had clearly not been sleeping. "Mr. Hale, I know about the accident," he said. The chain stayed on. Her face stayed still. "I know you were there," he continued. "I know you stayed with Emma." He paused. "I know it was 2 hours." Something moved through her expression, a tide going out maybe. Something that had been held in place by the assumption that nobody knew, that the thing she'd carried alone was hers alone. The chain came off the door. She didn't invite him in. She just stepped back, which was enough. The apartment was small and honest in its smallness. Nothing performative about the worn couch, or the mismatched kitchen chairs, or the stack of overdue mail on the counter that she'd clearly forgotten to move before answering the door, or decided at this point not to bother. There was a framed photograph on the windowsill that he didn't look at too long. A man with Olivia's same tired eyes, laughing at something off camera. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her arms crossed. Not hostile, just contained. "You went through my personnel file," she said. "Yes." "That's..." She pressed her lips together. "Yeah, of course you did. I needed to understand." "What do you need to understand exactly?" There was an edge in her voice now, not anger, more like the edge of someone who has been asked to explain themselves too many times in too many offices to too many people with clipboards. "Your daughter recognized my voice. It's not complicated. You talked to her for 2 hours in that car." "I talked at her. She wasn't talking." Olivia's jaw tightened. "She was in shock. I was trying to keep her calm. I said what seemed to work." "The storm always passes, little bird. Just look at the stars." Olivia looked away, out the dark window. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I said that a lot." "Where does it come from?" A pause, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "My mother," she said finally. "She used to say it when I was scared. It was dark, And Emma was so frightened, and the extrication team couldn't get to us yet. And I was running out of things to say, and it's what came out." She shrugged, one shoulder, a gesture that carried the particular weight of things that are too significant for the body to express, and so get minimized. I didn't know if she even heard me. She never responded. She was not in good shape. She heard every word. Olivia's eyes came back to him, wet at the edges. "She's been locked in silence for 3 years," Adrian said, and he heard the roughness in his own voice and didn't try to smooth it. "She hasn't spoken to anyone, not her doctor, not her teachers, not me." He stopped, started again. "Tonight, in that alcove, she said 3 words, the first 3 words in 3 years, and they were say it again." Olivia put her hand over her mouth. She turned away. Her shoulders moved once, sharply, the way shoulders move when you are deciding not to do something in front of a stranger. "I didn't know," she said when she'd turned back. Her voice was steady, but barely. "I gave my statement, and I left the department, and I didn't track what happened to any of the people from that night. I couldn't." She pressed her lips together. "I couldn't do that and still function. I understand." "Do you?" She looked at him directly then, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite an accusation and not quite a challenge. More like a test. More like someone checking whether the words in the mouth match anything behind them. He held her gaze. "No," he said, honestly. "Probably not completely." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then some of the containment went out of her posture, not all of it, just enough to let her lean against the kitchen counter instead of standing in the middle of the room like someone prepared to be told to leave. "What do you want, Mr. Hale?" He had come here with an answer to that question. Standing in his office reading the accident report, he had known exactly what he wanted, to understand, to offer whatever he could, to solve the problem of Olivia Carter's presence in his daughter's life the way he solved most problems, which was with resources and decisiveness and forward motion. Standing in this small kitchen in front of this specific woman, the answer felt less certain. What he wanted was complicated in ways he didn't have language for yet. "To say thank you," he said, "for what you did. In the car. For Emma." He paused. "For tonight." Olivia looked at him. "You don't owe me anything for either of those things," she said carefully. "I know. I didn't do either of them for... I'm not looking for anything. I know that too." So. He was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went past on the wet street. "She asked you to say it again." After 3 years of silence, that's what she said. "I need you to understand that I don't know what to do with that information exactly, but I know that whatever it means, whatever it requires, I'm not going to let it just be a moment that happened in a hotel alcove and then disappears." Olivia looked at him for a long time. He let her look. Let her take the measure of whatever she was taking the measure of. "It's late," she said finally. "It is. And you knocked on my door at 11 o'clock. "I did. I've got a 6 a.m. start tomorrow." "I'm aware." A pause that was almost, the beginning of something that wasn't hostility. "You should probably go," she said. "Probably." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a business card on the kitchen counter. She looked at it but didn't pick it up. "When you're ready to talk, I'll be available." He went to the door, opened it. "Mr. Hale." He turned. Olivia was still leaning against the counter, arms still crossed, the card still on the counter between them. "Is she okay?" she asked. "Tonight, after... Is she okay?" He thought about Emma in the car home, sitting in the back seat, looking out the window at the rain-wet streets. Not the blankness. Something else. Thoughtful, maybe, or just tired. Something with more texture. "She's sleeping," he said. "Mrs. Delgado said she went to sleep easily." Olivia nodded. She looked down at the counter. "Good," she said quietly. "That's good." He left. He stood in the hallway outside apartment 3F and listened to the city for a moment. Distant traffic, the building's pipes, the low hum of existence carrying on. He thought about a woman in a wrecked car on a mountain highway in the rain, holding a terrified child in the dark, saying the same 7 words over and over again for 2 hours. He thought about what it cost a person to carry something like that. and never have anyone know they were carrying it. He walked down the hallway. He took the stairs. He got into the car where Gerald was waiting without speaking, and Gerald, who understood the value of silence almost as well as he understood the value of being available, drove him home through the dark, wet streets of Seattle. At the Hale mansion, Adrian went upstairs. He checked on Emma. The door cracked 2 inches, just enough to see her in the nightlight, asleep on her stomach the way she'd slept since she was 3, one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress. He stood in the doorway for a while. Say it again. 3 words. His daughter's voice, rough with disuse, barely a sound. The first 3 words in 31 months. He didn't know what came next. He didn't have a plan, which was an unfamiliar condition and not a comfortable one. He was a man who built things from the ground up, and he did not know yet what he was building. But for the first time in a very long time, standing in the doorway watching his daughter sleep, Adrian Hale felt something he had almost forgotten was an option. Not hope, exactly. Something more cautious than hope. Something that hadn't earned its name yet. The beginning of a direction. The business card sat on Olivia's kitchen counter for 4 days. She didn't throw it away. She didn't move it. She stepped around it the way you step around something on the floor that you're not ready to deal with yet. Aware of it, slightly annoyed by the awareness, unwilling to resolve either. It migrated incrementally over those 4 days. From the spot where Adrian Hale had set it, to slightly left of center after she wiped the counter, to balanced against the salt shaker after an accidental bump, until it was face down on the edge of the counter, and she told herself she couldn't see the number anyway, so it didn't matter. She went to work. She finished the Grand Crescent East Corridor job on Wednesday. Martinez found a crack in the original plasterwork that added a day and a half to the schedule and put him in a mood that made him impossible to talk to and essential to have around because he was the only one who could fix it. She ate lunch on a folding chair in the service corridor, same place she'd been 4 nights ago, and did not let herself look at the staircase. She told herself that the thing that happened in the alcove was a coincidence of memory and fear response, that a frightened child had heard a familiar vocal pattern and responded to it, that it didn't require her to do anything. She told herself this with the specific repetitive conviction of someone building a wall out of reasonable explanations because they can feel something pressing against it from the other side. On Thursday night, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and her bank statements in front of her and did the accounting she'd been putting off for 2 weeks. The numbers were what the numbers were. Strand Restoration had 2 more jobs scheduled through November. A fireplace surround restoration in Queen Anne and a small commercial project in Sodo. That Martinez had underbid by 20% because he was an excellent craftsman and a terrible estimator. After expenses, after the monthly payment on the loan she'd taken out when the boiler in the apartment broke and the landlord took 3 weeks to respond, after the minimum on the card she'd used when Tommy's medical bills came in the final wave that insurance hadn't covered, she closed the laptop. Across the counter, the business card sat face down against the salt shaker. She picked it up, looked at it. Adrian Hale's name in clean sans serif, the Hale Maritime Foundation address, a direct line that bypassed whoever usually screened his calls. She put it face down again. She thought about this girl in the navy blue dress, the way her shoulders had come down, the way she'd said those 3 words in a voice that sounded like something unused and found again in a drawer. Say it again. Olivia pressed her thumb against the edge of the card. She thought about her mother, who had said those 7 words first, in a kitchen in Spokane during a thunderstorm when Olivia was 8 and had convinced herself the noise was something terrible. Her mother, who smelled like lavender hand cream and bad coffee, and who had a laugh that filled rooms, and who had been gone for 6 years now from a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in April. She thought about saying those words in the dark, in a wrecked car that smelled like radiator fluid and rain, with a child she didn't know pressed against her side because there was nowhere else for the child to be, and the darkness was complete, and the extrication team was 22 minutes out, and then 18 minutes out, and then 12. And the whole time Olivia had talked because silence was worse. Silence was where the fear lived, and she'd said everything she could think of, and when she ran out of things, she'd said her mother's words because they were the only ones left. She had never told anyone that. What the words were, where they came from, what it felt like to say them into the dark to a child who never responded, and whom she had been certain, for a long time afterward, hadn't heard a thing. She picked up the card and put it in the kitchen drawer. Not in the trash, not in her hand. in the drawer where things went when you weren't done with them, but weren't ready for them either. Then she went to bed and stared at the ceiling for an hour and a half before she slept. Adrian did not call her. He wanted to. The instinct was strong. He was a man who moved on things, who identified problems and applied solutions with a directness that had occasionally cost him relationships, and had generally served him well in every other context. The instinct said, call, explain what you need, establish parameters, move forward. But something in the specific quality of Olivia Carter's eyes, in the way she'd stood in her kitchen with her arms crossed and her jaw set, told him that approaching her the way he approached everything else was going to close the door rather than open it. And the door had to stay open. He didn't know exactly why he was certain of that, but he was certain the way he was certain about structural things, the certainty that came from looking at something long enough to understand its weight. So he didn't call. What he did instead was call Dr. Samuels. She came to the mansion on Friday morning, earlier than her usual appointment, because Adrian had asked her to come before Emma's tutor arrived, and she'd heard something in his voice that made her rearrange her schedule. She sat across from him in the kitchen. He'd offered the study. She'd said the kitchen was fine, which was the kind of small choice that Adrian had stopped questioning because Dr. Samuels made small choices that always turned out to be right. And he told her everything. She listened without interrupting. That was something Adrian had noticed in the first session 3 years ago. Dr. Samuels didn't perform listening. She just listened. No deliberate nods timed to show engagement, no careful expressions of appropriate response. She just sat there and let the words arrive, and when they were done, she sat with them for a moment before she said anything. She said 3 words, she said finally. 3 words. In the alcove. Yes, not a sound, not a point. 3 words in response to a specific verbal stimulus from a specific person. Dr. Samuels was quiet again. She had her notepad on the table, but she hadn't opened it, which meant she was thinking, not documenting. Tell me the words again. Say it again. He said it carefully, the same way he'd been turning it over in his head for 4 days. That was it. And the stimulus. 7 words. The storm always passes, little bird. Just look at the stars. Dr. Samuels wrote something on the notepad. There's a concept, she said slowly, in trauma treatment. We call it a somatic anchor, a sensory element, often a sound or a smell or a physical sensation that becomes linked to a specific emotional state during a traumatic event. The anchor essentially stores the emotional experience, the state of relative safety or of comfort, whatever was present at the moment. And when the anchor is reactivated, the stored emotional state becomes accessible again. She tapped her pen against the pad. For Emma, this woman's voice, specifically these words, this particular phrase, appears to have become a very strong somatic anchor for safety. Chitri poti dasumye saki. Adrian absorbed this. She heard those words for 2 hours in the car. 2 hours in an acute trauma state with her nervous system searching desperately for anything to attach to. Anything that said this is safe, this is survivable. Dr. Samuels met his eyes. The voice of the person who was with her became that signal. The words that person repeated most frequently became the clearest part of the signal. And when she heard them again, her nervous system recognized them, recognized the safety state they were attached to. She paused. Adrian, this is significant. I know. I mean clinically significant. This is the first voluntary speech in 31 months, the first direct request. She leaned forward slightly. Whatever this woman's connection to Emma is, it is not incidental. It's not just a coincidence of proximity. Emma's nervous system has maintained this anchor for 3 years. He was quiet. I want to meet her, Dr. Samuels said. She hasn't called. But you have her information. Yes. Then find a way to make the meeting possible. She said it simply, without the edge of someone who didn't understand the complexity of asking Adrian Hale to approach someone carefully. Not for you, for Emma. He knew that. He'd known it before she said it. But he'd needed someone else to say it too, because some things need witness. Olivia was on a 14-foot scaffold in Queen Anne when her phone rang, vibrating in the chest pocket of her work jacket, and she ignored it because she was in the middle of a delicate section of plasterwork over a Victorian fireplace surround, and the dust mask was fogging her glasses, and Martinez was saying something from below about the plaster mix that she couldn't hear clearly enough to respond to. She checked it on her lunch break. The number wasn't Adrian Hale's direct line. It was an office number, area code 206, and the voicemail was from someone who introduced herself as Dr. Renata Samuels, who said she was Emma Hale's therapist, and who asked, quietly and without pressure, if Olivia would be willing to speak with her. Olivia listened to the voicemail twice, sitting on the back bumper of the Strand Restoration van with her mask around her neck and her lunch, a gas station sandwich she'd grabbed at 6 a.m., sitting uneaten in her lap. She called back at 1:30. Dr. Samuels answered on the second ring. "Ms. Carter, thank you for calling. I'm not promising anything," Olivia said immediately. "I want to be clear about that." "Of course." No offense taken, no pressure applied, just acknowledgement. Olivia found that she trusted the voice slightly more because of it. "What do you want from me?" "I'd like to meet you in person, if you're willing. Not at the Hale residence, anywhere you're comfortable. Just a conversation. I want to understand what happened in that alcove from your perspective. And I want to share some things with you about Emma's situation that I think would help you understand what your presence means to her." Olivia looked at the sandwich in her lap. The bread was slightly stale. She'd been eating a lot of slightly stale bread lately, the kind from the gas station that was 3 days from its date and marked down to $1.49, because the alternative was spending another $6 on something fresh, and the accounting she'd done on Thursday night had been very clear about the $6. "I work until 5, she said, most days. "I can meet you after 5, whenever suits you. There's a coffee shop on Pike, the one next to the dry cleaner. Alder. I'll find it. Monday, 6 o'clock. I'll be there. Ms. Carter." A pause, deliberate. "You don't owe Emma anything, or Mr. Hale. I want you to know that's not the premise of this conversation." "Then what is?" "I think you've been carrying something alone for a long time," Dr. Samuels said, "and I think it might be lighter if someone else knew what you were carrying." Olivia was quiet for a moment. Outside the van, a pigeon landed on the sidewalk and started investigating something near the storm drain with the absolute focus of a creature that had no concept of irrelevance. "Monday at 6, she said, and hung up. She ate the stale sandwich. It was fine. She'd had worse. Alder Coffee was a narrow room with exposed brick and mismatched chairs, and the particular acoustic quality of a space where the noise level was high enough to provide cover for private conversations without being so loud that you had to raise your voice. Olivia had chosen it for exactly this reason, also because the Americano was $4.25, which was on the edge of what she could justify on a Monday evening, and they never rushed you. Dr. Samuels was already there when Olivia arrived at 6:04, still in her work jacket, hair still up in the knot she'd shoved it into at 7 a.m. The therapist was smaller than Olivia had imagined from the voice. Compact, mid-50s, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd been told as a child to sit up straight and had never entirely stopped. She had 2 cups on the table. "I ordered you an Americano," she said. "I hope that's all right. The barista said it's what you usually get." Olivia sat down across from her and felt briefly and irrationally slightly ambushed. "You asked the barista what I usually get. You said you came here often. I thought it was a reasonable inference." Dr. Samuels smiled slightly. It was a specific kind of smile. Not an apology, and not entirely not an apology. "I have a habit of gathering information. Occupational hazard. Something you share with your client's father. Adrian Hale is many things. Subtle is rarely one of them." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "Though he did manage not to call you for 4 days, which I understand was a significant exercise of restraint." Olivia almost laughed. "Didn't, quite. He told you that?" "He told me he wanted to call approximately 11 times and didn't. He seemed to think this represented personal growth." "Does it? For him? Honestly, yes." She tilted her head slightly. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure. Someone more guarded, maybe? Mr. Hale described you as someone who doesn't give anything away." "I've had 4 days to prepare for this conversation." Dr. Samuels nodded slowly. "Then let me be direct, since you seem to prefer it. Emma Hale has not spoken voluntarily to another person in 31 months. Last Tuesday night, she spoke 3 words. Those 3 words were a direct response to a verbal stimulus from you. Words you said to her during the accident 3 years ago. She paused. You already knew all of that. I suspected most of it. What I suspect you don't know, Baum, what Adrian didn't know until I explained it, is what that moment represents clinically. Emma's nervous system locked onto your voice and your words during an extremely acute trauma state and has held that anchor for 3 years. Hearing you say those words again didn't just comfort her. It gave her nervous system access to the emotional state she was in when she first heard them, which was a state of relative safety, possibly the last state of genuine safety she remembers from that night. Olivia looked at the table. Her Americano was good. They made it right here, not too bitter. She made herself focus on that detail for a moment. So what you're telling me, she said slowly, is that her system has been looking for that signal for 3 years. In the way that traumatized nervous systems look for their anchors, yes. Not consciously, but yes. The noise of the coffee shop moved around them. Someone at the next table was having a completely separate and entirely normal conversation about renovating a bathroom. And the absolute normality of it was, for a moment, a strange comfort. I left the department, Olivia said. It wasn't what she'd meant to say first. It came out because the pressure of the previous thought was looking for somewhere to go. After Tommy died, my husband, I couldn't go back to that work. I'd been doing it for 4 years and I loved it, I was good at it, and after the accident I submitted the resignation, and I didn't go back, and I told myself that was self-preservation. Dr. Samuels didn't fill the silence. She just let it be a silence. But the truth is, Olivia continued, and she heard the thinness in her own voice and didn't try to thicken it. The truth is that after that night, after the accident, I stopped believing I was any good at it, at helping people, because I sat in that car for 2 hours and the woman in the front seat died and I couldn't. I said the words and I held the kid and the outcome was still what it was. And I know that's not how it works. I know the outcome wasn't in my hands. I know that. She wrapped both her hands around the coffee cup. I still stopped believing it. Dr. Samuels set her glasses on the table. It was a small gesture, deliberate. Can I ask you something? You're going to anyway. A small acknowledgement. The woman in the front seat, Sarah Hale, did she die quickly? Olivia pressed her lips together. No. Was she conscious when you arrived? In and out. Did she know her daughter was in the car? Yes, she asked about her. That was the first thing she said. And what did you tell her? Olivia was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough for the bathroom renovation conversation at the next table to move through 3 separate opinions on tile grout. I told her Emma was safe, she said finally. I told her I was with Emma, and Emma was safe, and she didn't need to worry. Was that true? At that moment? Emma was alive and physically unharmed. That's not what I asked. Olivia looked up at her. Was Emma safe? Dr. Samuels asked again, quietly. In that moment, with you there, was she as safe as she could possibly be given the circumstances? A long pause. Yes, Olivia said, reluctantly, like the word cost something. Yes, she was. So you told a dying mother the truth, and then you stayed with her daughter for 2 hours in the dark, and you gave that child the only anchor she was able to hold on to, the one thing her nervous system kept for 3 years and recognized again the moment it heard your voice. Dr. Samuels picked her glasses back up. That is not the record of someone who failed at helping people, Miss Carter. The thing in Olivia's chest, the small, sharp weight she'd been carrying since October, the one that was 3 years old and had never quite gotten lighter, shifted, not dissolved, not resolved, just shifted, the way weight shifts when someone else puts their hand under it and you realize you haven't been the only one holding it. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth briefly. Then she put her hand down and looked at her coffee. What does she need? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was good at steady when it mattered. Emma, what does she actually need from me, if anything? Dr. Samuels considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know yet. I think the most important thing right now is that she knows you exist, that you're a real person, not a voice she imagined or a dream she had. I think she needs to encounter you in a safe, controlled way. Her environment, her pace, her choice of engagement. She paused. I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to become a fixture in her life, or to take on any kind of caretaking role. That is not the ask. What I'm asking is whether you'd be willing to meet her, once, formally, with me present. Let her see you. Let her hear your voice in a context that isn't panic and noise and darkness. And if she responds the same way, then we take the next small step, and the one after that, always at her pace. Olivia stared at her coffee. She thought about the accounting she'd done Thursday night. She thought about the drawer where the business card was. She thought about a woman she'd never met asking about her daughter from the front seat of a wrecked car, and herself saying she's safe, she's with me, she's safe and meaning every word of it. You keep saying I'm not asking you to, Olivia said, but you are asking me to. Let's be honest about that. Dr. Samuels met her eyes. Yes, I am. I'm asking because Emma needs it, and because I think, for reasons that have nothing to do with obligation, that you might need it too. Olivia didn't answer immediately. She finished her Americano. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Spokane, thunderstorm at the windows, the smell of lavender hand cream. When? She said. Adrian was in the mansion kitchen at 7:15 Thursday morning when Mrs. Delgado called him from the hallway to say that Emma was asking for cereal. He stopped, coffee halfway to his mouth. She asked? She pointed? She asked, Mrs. Delgado said from the hallway. She was using her careful voice, the one she used when she was afraid to say something too loudly in case the saying of it broke the thing itself. She came to the kitchen door and she said, cereal, please. 2 words. Different words from the 3 in the alcove, which meant they weren't just a stimulus response pattern, they weren't just the one phrase triggered by the one anchor. They were new words, chosen words, the beginning of voluntary communication that came from inside her rather than in response to something outside. Adrian set down his coffee and walked to the kitchen doorway, where Emma was standing in her pajamas with her hair doing the thing it did in humidity and her gap-toothed expression entirely neutral, waiting for someone to execute the cereal request. He crouched down to her level. Morning, he said. Carefully, like someone approaching something breakable that he desperately didn't want to break. Emma looked at him. That direct look. The one with weight. Cereal, she said. Please. The please was hers. He hadn't coached it. Dr. Samuels hadn't introduced it. It was just hers. A piece of Emma that had come back from wherever the rest of her had been. He went to the cupboard. He got the cereal she liked. The one with the small oat squares that she'd been picking out of the bowl with her fingers for 6 months without eating anything else. And he poured it into a bowl and added the milk she preferred, which was the oat kind because at some point she'd decided dairy was not for her, and he put it on the kitchen table. Emma climbed into her chair and started eating. He stood at the kitchen counter with his coffee and watched his daughter eat cereal at 7:15 in the morning and tried to contain what was happening in his chest, which was not quite describable and not something he was going to let himself make a production of, because the moment you made a production of Emma's progress was the moment the progress felt like pressure, and the pressure did what pressure did. Dr. Samuels is coming today, he said casually, working at casual with everything he had. Emma looked up, kept eating. And she's bringing someone, Adrian said. Someone you met last week, at the hotel. Emma's spoon stopped moving. She didn't say anything, but her body did the thing it had done in the alcove, a very specific stillness, not the frozen stillness of fear, but the stillness of attention, the stillness of a person who is listening with everything they have. She's coming to say hello, Adrian said. That's all. You don't have to do anything. Emma looked back at her cereal. After a moment, she resumed eating. He turned back to his coffee and exhaled through his nose, slowly, carefully, with the practiced quietness of a man who had become an expert at feeling things that nobody in the room needed to see him feel. Olivia pulled up to the Hale mansion at 2 in the afternoon in the Strand restoration van, which was the only vehicle she had, which meant she pulled up to the iron gate of a waterfront property that was probably worth $12 million in a white van with Strand restoration. We bring it back to life in blue letters on the side, and she sat there for a moment with the engine running, She'd worn her cleanest jeans and a pullover she'd gotten 3 Christmases ago that was still in reasonable shape. She'd washed her hair and left it down. She'd looked at herself in the bathroom mirror that morning with the critical eye of someone who knew the difference between presentable and impressive and had settled, without a lot of drama, on the former. She was not here to impress anyone. She was here because a child's therapist had asked her to come, and because Olivia had said yes, and Olivia, whatever else she was, kept her word. The gate opened before she touched the intercom. She pulled the van up the driveway. Flagstone, she noticed automatically. Locally quarried by the look of it, good quality, well-maintained, and parked in front of the main entrance. The house was large without being theatrical about it. Glass and cedar and stone, built to face the water, the kind of architecture that understood what it had and didn't need to shout. Adrian Hale met her at the front door. He looked different from the last time she'd seen him. No suit, dark jeans, a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He looked, she thought, less like a CEO and more like a person, which was either genuine or calculated, and she wasn't sure yet which. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Dr. Samuels is here?" she asked. "Inside. Emma's in the living room." Olivia nodded. She followed him through the entrance, noting, with the automatic observation of someone who spent her working life reading the bones of buildings, the quality of the restoration on the original ceiling beams. Someone had done good work here, careful work, the kind of work that respected what was already there. She noticed this the way she always noticed such things, the way her brain settled itself on the familiar and concrete when the rest of her was navigating something less stable. The living room was large and faced the water, gray November light coming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows and making everything soft-edged. Dr. Samuels was seated on the couch, and on the floor, cross-legged, with a drawing notebook on her lap, was Emma. She was drawing. Or she had been drawing. Her hand had stopped moving when Olivia entered the room. She was very still, in the way she'd been still in the alcove. The way that Olivia now understood was not absence, but its opposite. Olivia stopped just inside the doorway. She didn't advance. She didn't speak. She waited. Emma looked up. Brown eyes, wide-set, slightly too serious for a 6-year-old, hair going wild at the temples from humidity, a gap between her 2 front teeth. A child who looked, in this moment, not frightened exactly, but at the edge of something, balanced on a point between the self that had been sealed away and the self that was trying to find its way back to the surface. Olivia sat down on the floor. Not the couch, not a chair. The floor. Cross-legged, at Emma's level, near the doorway, far enough that the space between them was entirely Emma's to cross or not cross as she chose. She heard Adrian shift behind her, then go still, which meant he understood. She looked at Emma. Emma looked at her. "Hi," Olivia said. Simple, quiet. Not trying to do anything with the word beyond mean it. Emma didn't respond. But she didn't look away either. She looked at Olivia with that weighing attention, the kind that children who can't talk develop because they're spending their communication budget on listening instead. Olivia looked at the drawing notebook in Emma's lap. "Is that a sky?" Emma looked down at the notebook, then back up at Olivia. She turned the notebook around, held it up so Olivia could see. It was a sky. A road below it, and above the road a sky full of stars, drawn with the particular density of someone who is drawing from memory rather than imagination. Too many stars in too specific arrangements to be random. Olivia looked at it for a moment. "That's a lot of stars," she said. Emma lowered the notebook back to her lap. She looked at it for a moment. Then she did something that nobody in the room had seen her do before. She slid the notebook across the floor, the 6 feet between them, until it bumped gently against Olivia's knee. Olivia picked it up carefully. She looked at the drawing. She was aware of the absolute stillness in the room behind her. Adrian not breathing, Dr. Samuels not moving, everyone suspended in the fragile membrane of the moment. She looked at Emma. "You drew it from memory," Olivia said quietly. Not a question. Emma, very slightly, nodded. Olivia held the drawing for a moment. She thought about a particular configuration of stars visible through the shattered rear window of a wrecked car, the way she'd pointed them out to keep a child's attention on something distant and constant while the world immediately around them was broken and wrong. "I used to lie on the hood of my car when I was a teenager," she said, the same quiet register, not performing calm, just being in it.
Out where I grew up, you could see every star. My mother taught me the constellations, but I could never remember their names. I'd lie there and look at them, and they were always the same. No matter what happened, they were always the same. Emma was watching her.
That's why I said it, Olivia said. That night, I said, look at the stars because they were there, through the window, and they were the same stars they always were, and that seemed like something worth knowing. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had been in the same place during the same terrible night from different angles, and who were, for the first time, sitting together on the same side of it. Emma reached out and touched the edge of the drawing notebook with one finger. Olivia handed it back to her. Emma took it and held it against her chest for a moment, the way a small person holds something they are not ready to put down. Then she picked up her pencil and resumed drawing. Just like that. The resumption of a person who has decided something, satisfied a question, and returned to the business of living. Olivia sat on the floor and let the tension drain out of her shoulders slowly, one by one. From behind her, very quietly, she heard Adrian exhale. Dr. Samuels, who had been watching all of it, said nothing. But when Olivia glanced back at her, the therapist gave her a small nod. Not celebratory, not effusive. Just the specific nod of someone who has seen something they recognize as real and wanted to acknowledge it. They stayed like that for another 40 minutes. Emma drew. Olivia sat on the floor. Adrian brought 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen and set one near Olivia's knee without asking if she wanted it, which she did, and Dr. Samuels made occasional quiet observations that kept the room feeling like a room rather than an event. Emma didn't say anything else, but twice more she slid the drawing notebook across the floor to Olivia. Each time Olivia looked at it carefully, said something specific and honest about what she saw, and slid it back. When Olivia stood to leave at 3:40, Emma looked up from her notebook. She didn't say anything. She just looked with those 2 serious eyes, and Olivia held the gaze for a moment. It was good to see you, Olivia said. Emma looked back at her drawing, but she tore the top page from her notebook, carefully, slowly, along the perforated edge, and held it out without looking up. The drawing of the road and the stars, the one from memory. Olivia took it. Thank you, she said quietly, and meant it in more directions than she could have named out loud. She followed Adrian to the front door. He walked with her down to the van, hands in his pockets, the cold November air carrying the smell of the water. She gave you her drawing, he said. She did. He nodded, looking at the driveway. She doesn't do that. She doesn't give them away. I know, Olivia said, because she did know, or she understood, which was close enough. I'll take care of it. He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that she hadn't quite seen in the kitchen of her apartment when he'd been operating on adrenaline and shock and the need to understand something. This was quieter. This was a man who had just watched something happen in his own living room that he hadn't been able to manufacture with money or connections or sheer force of will, and who was sitting with the specific humility of someone who has run out of the things that used to work. I know I said there's no obligation, he said. Your therapist said that, you didn't. He accepted that. Right. I didn't. He looked back at the water. I don't know what to ask for. I've been trying to figure out what the right ask is, and I can't frame it the way I frame other things. Because this isn't a business arrangement. No, she agreed. It's not. But Emma, he stopped, started again. Emma is not going to get better just because she spoke 3 words, or asked for cereal, or gave you a drawing. That's not how this works. Dr. Samuels has been explaining that to me for 18 months, and I'm starting to actually believe it, which I recognize is slow, but I'm getting there. He looked back at her. What I know is that whatever happened in that alcove, and whatever happened in that living room today, is more than anything we've managed in 3 years. And you're the variable. I'm a stranger, Olivia said. You're the person she's been holding on to for 3 years, he said simply. Not a correction, just the other version of the truth. She looked at the drawing in her hand, the road, the stars, the particular density of a memory held by a 6-year-old for 3 years. I'm not going to stop showing up, she said finally. It came out before she'd fully decided it, the way things come out when they've been decided somewhere deeper than the conscious mind and are just waiting for the mouth to catch up. I'm not promising anything about what it looks like or how often, but I'm not going to disappear. Adrian looked at her.
Okay, he said. Okay, she said, and got in the van.
She drove back to her apartment through the gray November afternoon with the drawing on the passenger seat beside her, and she didn't look at it while she was driving because she was trying to see the road, but she was aware of it. The way you're aware of something in your peripheral vision that matters. Back in the apartment, she found a frame. It was a cheap one from a box of Tommy's things she'd never fully unpacked. Glass and a thin wooden edge, the kind that held a 4x6 print. The drawing was close enough to that size that it fit with a small adjustment. She set it on the windowsill next to the photograph of Tommy laughing at something off camera. She opened the kitchen drawer and took out the business card. She didn't call the number, not tonight, but she put it on the counter, face up this time, where she could see it. The face-up business card lasted 3 days before Olivia called the number. She didn't plan the call. She wasn't sitting at the counter composing what she'd say, running it through her head the way she ran estimates through her head before presenting them to clients. She was washing dishes at 8:40 on a Sunday morning, the radio on low. A jazz station she kept on as background noise because silence in the apartment had a specific weight that she hadn't figured out how to carry comfortably yet. And she picked up the phone in the middle of rinsing a coffee mug and dialed before the rational part of her mind had fully clocked what the emotional part had already decided. It rang twice. "Hale! It's Olivia Carter." A pause. Not surprised exactly. More like the pause of someone who has been waiting for a thing and is adjusting to the fact that the waiting is over. "Good morning," he said. "I'm not going to pretend I'm calling just to say hello," she said. "I've been thinking about what you said, about the foundation, about the recovery centers." "Okay. I have a question first." "Ask it." She set the coffee mug in the drying rack. "Is this you trying to solve a problem? Because I understand that's how you're wired, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but I need to know if this is you trying to use a resource or if it's something else." The silence on the other end was not defensive. She gave him credit for that. "Both," he said. "Honestly, I want to help Emma, and I want to help you, and those two things are not entirely separable. If that's a problem, I'd rather know now." She thought about that. She appreciated the honesty more than she expected to. Most people in his position would have given her the cleaner answer, the one that sounded better, the one that cost nothing to say. "It's not a problem," she said. "It's just something I needed to know." "What else do you need to know?" "Nothing yet." She looked out the kitchen window. The sky was doing the Seattle thing, low clouds, the particular flat gray that could go either way. "I'll come by Wednesday, after 5. I'll be here." She hung up and went back to the dishes, and the jazz station played something with a slow trumpet line, and she stood at the sink for a moment thinking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of decision. What happened over the following 6 weeks did not happen smoothly. That was the first thing worth saying, because the easy version of the story would have Emma's recovery as a steady upward line and the three of them finding their rhythm without friction, and the easy version would be a lie. What actually happened was more like the restoration work Olivia did for a living. 2 steps of careful progress, 1 step of damage assessment, repeat. There were good days and bad ones. There were visits that felt like something was building, and visits that felt like nothing was happening at all, which Dr. Samuels said was itself something happening, but which was hard to believe when you were in the middle of it. Emma spoke in small increments, not conversationally, not yet. Not the way children talk when they've never been interrupted by 3 years of silence. She spoke in requests and answers and occasionally observations that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She would say a thing and then look slightly startled by the fact that she'd said it. Which doctor? Samuels noted carefully, and Adrian watched with the expression of someone trying very hard not to react visibly to something that was moving him tremendously. The words she used around Olivia were different from the words she used around Adrian or Dr. Samuels. With Adrian, she was beginning to say functional things. "Cereal, please. The blue one. I don't want to." Statements of preference and need, the vocabulary of a child learning to occupy her own space again. With Dr. Samuels, she was slowly developing the language of her internal world, halting and imprecise, the way new language always is. But with Olivia, she said other things. Observations. Questions. Things with no clear practical purpose except that she wanted to say them. The first real question Emma asked Olivia arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week. They were in the living room, Emma on the floor with her notebook, Olivia in the chair near the window.
and the question came without preamble, without looking up from the drawing. "Were you scared?"
Olivia didn't have to ask what she meant. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to be honest with Emma, which she'd decided early on was non-negotiable, because Emma was a person who had been through enough to know the difference between truth and the kind things said in place of truth. "Yes," she said. "I was scared." Emma's pencil moved. "Of what?" "That I'd say the wrong thing, that you'd stop, that you'd go somewhere I couldn't follow." Emma absorbed this. "But you kept talking." "I kept talking." "Why?" Olivia looked at the gray water through the window. "Because silence felt worse, and because I didn't know what else to do, and doing something seemed better than doing nothing, even if the something was just words." Emma's pencil stopped. "My mom talked," she said. "Before." She said it carefully. "The way you say things you've been holding for a long time and are finally testing the weight of out loud. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear her talking." Olivia was very still. "I think she was talking to the other people," Emma said. "Not to me, but I could hear her voice." She looked at the drawing. It was nice to hear her voice. It took Olivia a moment before she could trust herself to speak. "What did her voice sound like?" Emma considered this seriously. "Warm," she said finally. Like when you're cold and someone gives you something warm to hold." Olivia nodded. Her throat was doing things she was managing by virtue of the fact that she was an adult who had learned to manage her throat under difficult circumstances. "That's a good way to describe it," she said. Emma returned to her drawing. She didn't say anything else about it, but she'd said it, which was its own thing. The fact of saying it existing separately from what it cost. That evening, after Olivia had gone, Adrian knocked on Dr. Samuel's door. The therapist had stayed late at his request, waiting in the kitchen while Olivia and Emma had their time in the living room. "She talked about Sarah," Adrian said. Dr. Samuels looked up from her notes. "Emma?" To Olivia. "She talked about her mother's voice." Dr. Samuels set her pen down. "Adrian, I know." He sat down across from her. He was tired in a way that showed around his eyes, the specific tiredness that had been accumulating for 3 years and was only now, slowly, becoming something other than just exhaustion. "I know it's good. I know it's what we want." He pressed his thumb against the edge of the table. She's talked to me more in the past 3 weeks than in the past 3 years, but she hasn't talked to me about her mother." Dr. Samuels was quiet for a moment. "She may not be ready to share those things with you yet," she said finally. "Not because she doesn't trust you, because talking about Sarah with you it's different. There's grief layered into that conversation that doesn't exist in the conversation with Olivia. Olivia is a safe distance from the loss. You are inside it." Adrian looked at the table. "That's not a failure," Dr. Samuels said. "That's just the shape of things right now." "I know. You keep saying that. I keep needing to say it." He glanced up. "How do you do that thing where you know something's true and you still need to keep reminding yourself?" "The same way everyone does," she said, "badly and repeatedly." He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him in the 3 years she'd been working with the Hale family, and she logged it without comment, the way she logged other small things. Olivia's financial situation did not improve on its own while she was making Tuesday afternoon visits to the Hale mansion. Strand Restoration finished the So-Do commercial job in early December, at which point Martinez's underbid became an official loss of about $2,000 after expenses, which Martinez felt genuinely terrible about, and which Olivia absorbed without making him feel worse, because there was no point, and he was a good worker, and good workers were harder to find than $2,000. Theoretically. In practice, the $2,000 was the thing she was short on. She took a weekend job helping a friend of a friend move furniture in exchange for cash. She pushed back the boiler loan payment by 2 weeks, which the loan company permitted once per year and which she'd already used, so she had to call and have an actual conversation with a person in a call center who read from a script while she looked at the kitchen ceiling and made agreeable sounds. She did not ask Adrian Hale for anything. She'd thought about it. The thought arrived in her head with the kind of clarity that comes at 3 in the morning when your brain has stopped performing optimism, She could call the number on the business card and say something about cash flow and interim work, and she was fairly certain that within 24 hours some portion of her immediate problem would be solved. She was certain of it, the way she was certain of other things about Adrian Hale, which was with the specific certainty of someone who has been watching a person closely in unguarded moments. She didn't call. She didn't know how to ask for help without it becoming something she owed, and she was already operating in enough debt of the invisible kind without adding more. This was not rational, and she knew it was not rational, and she also knew that knowing a thing was irrational didn't automatically make it easier to act against. What she did instead, on a Friday afternoon in December when the restoration van was in the parking lot of the hardware store and Martinez was inside arguing about an order and she had 45 minutes, was drive to the city library branch on Capitol Hill and spend those 45 minutes at a computer researching something she'd been turning over in the back of her head since the meeting with Dr. Samuels. Trauma-informed design for pediatric recovery spaces. It wasn't a field she knew. Her background was restoration. Reading old buildings, understanding what had been there before, and how to bring it back. But she'd been in enough spaces to know the difference between a room that felt safe and a room that merely functioned. She knew it the way she knew the difference between a correctly mixed plaster and one that looked right and would crack in 6 months, instinctively, from the material itself, before the analysis caught up. The library computer had limited time, and the research was dense, and she didn't get far before Martinez texted that they needed to leave. But she took notes in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, the one she used for measurements and supply lists, and the notes were next to the measurements and supply lists, and she looked at them on the drive back and thought she'd been good at her paramedic work because she understood intuitively that the environment of an emergency mattered. Not just practically, not just clear pathways and accessible equipment, but emotionally. The way you positioned yourself relative to a patient, the tone of the room, what you took away and what you kept. She'd learned this in training and then relearned it in practice and then had it confirmed in the most direct possible way, in the back of a wrecked car where the only tools she had were her body and her voice. She thought there were other Emmas, not the same story. The stories were all different, but children in the aftermath of things, in the specific kind of broken space that came after the crisis team left and the paperwork was filed, in the ordinary rooms that were supposed to feel safe and didn't quite, because safety wasn't a function of drywall and recessed lighting, it was something you had to build into a space intentionally, the way you built anything that mattered. She filled 3 pages of the notebook before she told herself to stop. It was Adrian who brought it up first. He did it on a Wednesday in mid-December, not in the living room where Emma was doing her thing with the notebook, but in the kitchen afterward, where Olivia had developed a habit of staying for 20 minutes, drinking the coffee that Mrs. Delgado reliably offered before making the drive back across the city. It had happened organically. She'd stayed the first time because Emma had fallen asleep on the floor, and it had seemed wrong to leave before someone more appropriate had handled the transition. And the second time because Mrs. Delgado had put a cup in her hand before she'd thought about whether to accept it. And by the third time, it was simply what happened on Wednesdays. "I want to ask you something," Adrian said. He was leaning against the counter with his own coffee, and he said it in the tone he used when he'd been thinking about a thing for longer than he was going to admit. "Ask it. The foundation work. The recovery centers." He looked at his cup. "I've been talking to architects. Good ones. Firms that do institutional work, healthcare environments. They keep showing me things that are technically correct and completely wrong." Olivia waited. "Too much glass," he said. "Too open. Everything about abundance and light and visibility. I keep looking at these plans and thinking, Emma would never be comfortable in any of these spaces. Not the Emma I know, not a child who needs somewhere to disappear into rather than somewhere to be seen." He looked up at her. "I think the people designing these spaces have never actually sat with a traumatized child in the particular way that you've sat with one." The 3 pages of notes in her jacket pocket sat there as if they had weight. "What are you asking?" she said. "I'm asking if you'd consider consulting, I suppose is the word. Not a formal arrangement, not a thing that requires you to have credentials you don't have, because honestly the credentials these architects have haven't helped. I just want you to look at the plans. Tell me what's wrong with them." Olivia set her coffee down. "Adrian, I know. You're going to pay me." "Obviously. Not as a favor?" As a contractor, he said. Consulting rate, standard terms. Marcus can draw up the paperwork. I'm not an architect. I know what you are, he said. You're someone who understood, with no equipment and no preparation, how to make a terrified 6-year-old feel safe in the worst possible circumstances. I want that knowledge in the room when these plans get made. I'll pay for it accordingly. Olivia looked at him. She was trying to assess the question she kept coming back to with Adrian Hale, which was whether the thing he said was the whole truth or the best-sounding part of it. He had the facility of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where words were tools, where the right framing was a structural element as real as anything physical. She didn't always know which version of him she was getting. She thought he was being straight with her now. She thought the tell was the way he looked slightly sideways when he said it, the way people look when they're saying something true that they're also aware they're asking a lot with. I want to see the plans, she said. I'm not agreeing to anything until I see the plans. Fair. And if they're not fixable, if it's too far along and the changes would be too substantial, then we tell the architects that and figure out what's actually fixable. He said it without the defensiveness of someone who'd been told his plans were wrong before and hadn't liked it. I'm not looking for validation. I'm looking for someone who'll tell me what's actually wrong. Olivia picked up her coffee again. She thought about Martinez and the Sodu underbid and the loan company's call center script and the library computer and the 3 pages of notes in her pocket. Wednesday, she said. Bring the plans Wednesday. The plans were, as Adrian had said, technically correct and completely wrong. They were beautiful documents, the kind of architectural drawings that looked like art when they were framed, rendered in the clean lines of a firm that had won awards and published in journals and had 6-figure billings per project. Olivia spread them across the kitchen table on the following Wednesday and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Adrian sat across from her and didn't rush it. She was beginning to understand that he had 2 modes, the push and the wait, and he was getting better at knowing which one a situation called for, though it clearly cost him something each time he chose the wait. The sensory room, she said finally. This one. She pointed to the floor plan for what the proposal labeled the therapeutic relaxation environment. It was circular, with 4 entry points, and the ceiling was domed and studded with adjustable LED panels that could simulate a star field or shift to warm tones or go dim. The floor was padded, the walls were smooth and curved. What's wrong with it? Adrian asked. It's too open, too contained, paradoxically, because it's round and there are no corners. Children who are in sensory overwhelm or acute anxiety don't want circular. They want corners. They want something at their back. She traced the outline on the drawing. Emma was in a corner when I found her. Both times in the alcove, she was backed against 2 walls. In here, she goes to the corner by the window. She looked up. This room has nowhere to go. Adrian looked at the drawing. So redesign it. I'm not a designer. You just described exactly what's wrong with the design. That's more than these architects have managed in 3 meetings. He paused. Sketch it. Whatever you're seeing in your head, just sketch it. She picked up the pen he'd left on the table. She looked at the blank margin of the architectural drawing, which felt like something you shouldn't write on, and then wrote on it anyway because the alternative was saying she didn't know what she was doing, which wasn't true. What she sketched was not architectural. It was functional. A room with defined zones rather than one open space. A low section under a lowered ceiling where the walls angled in and created exactly the kind of contained, cornered space that a frightened child could tuck into. Natural light on one side, controllable darkness on the other. Materials that had texture that you could press your hands against and feel something real. No dome. A regular ceiling, not too high, not institutional. The kind of room that knew it was a room. Adrian looked at what she drew for a long time. This is it, he said. It's a sketch. It's not a blueprint. I know what a blueprint is. This is what's been missing. He looked at her. How many of these rooms do you think you could design? Not alone, with architects doing the actual technical work, but with you directing what matters functionally. Adrian, I have 11 sites. The foundation is committed to all 11 within 2 years. He said it plainly, like a fact rather than a pitch. I've been working with a firm that is smart and expensive and has never spent 2 hours in a wrecked car with a frightened child. I'm asking if you want to be the person who knows what I know,
that the academic understanding and the actual knowledge are two different things, and I'm missing the actual knowledge, and you have it. Olivia looked at the sketch. It was imperfect. She could see three things wrong with it, even as she looked. Proportions that needed adjustment, a practical issue with the lowered ceiling section that would need to be resolved with the building codes. But it was right in the way that mattered, which was that it was built around the child rather than the concept of the child. I'd need to learn things, she said. Serious things. About trauma-informed design, about the existing research, about how other facilities have done this. Yes. That takes time. Yes. And while I'm learning things, I'm not running restoration jobs, which means I'll pay you a retainer, he said, enough to cover your operating costs and a salary while the project develops. We formalize it as a consulting agreement. Marcus already has the framework. You already had Marcus draw up the framework. I had Marcus draw up the framework last week, he said, without apology. Because this was where the conversation was going to land, and I didn't want administrative lag to be the reason it didn't happen. She looked at him. I realize, he said, that being several steps ahead is something I do that annoys people. Does it bother you when it annoys people? Not usually. A beat. A little, with you. She didn't know what to do with that exactly, so she left it where it was and returned to the sketch. I want to see the other sites, she said, before I agree to anything. I want to see the physical spaces, not just the plans. When? After New Year's. I have jobs through Christmas. After New Year's, then. She folded her sketch and put it in her jacket pocket, next to the 3 pages of library notes. The kitchen was warm. Through the window, the December water was going dark with the early sunset, turning from gray to that particular deep blue-green that Seattle water did in winter when the light was going but not quite gone. From down the hall, Emma's voice drifted through. Not words, just a sound, something small and thoughtful, the sound of a child talking to herself over a drawing, a sound that 3 months ago had not been there. Both of them heard it. Neither of them said anything about it. Christmas at the Hale Mansion was something Adrian had been managing with the same grim efficiency he applied to everything difficult. His brother Cole came up from Portland with his wife and their 2 children, boys, 8 and 10, loud in the way that healthy children were loud, which was a specific kind of loud that the Hale Mansion had not contained in a while. Emma, to everyone's surprise, did not retreat. She didn't join them exactly, but she sat on the periphery of the living room on Christmas morning while her cousins destroyed the wrapping paper situation with maximum force, and she watched. And at one point, the 8-year-old, whose name was James and who had been briefed by his mother to be gentle with Emma, but who was 8 and therefore forgot within 20 minutes, crawled over to her and showed her something on a new handheld game device, and Emma leaned in and looked at it. She didn't speak, but she looked. And she pointed once at something on the screen, apparently a meaningful observation, because James responded to it with the enthusiasm of a child who has been understood and went off to demonstrate something on the device that he clearly felt the point about. Cole watched this from across the room and then looked at Adrian with an expression that Adrian couldn't fully read. Something between relief and an emotion that didn't have a clean name, the emotion of watching someone you love survive something. She looks better, Cole said quietly, during the kitchen coffee hour when the children were supervised by Cole's wife in the living room. Different. Something's different. She's talking more. More than, Adrian, she said 4 things to me since I got here. Before I think I got 1 word in 2 years. And that was maybe. Adrian poured himself more coffee. Something shifted. What shifted? He told his brother, briefly, the gala, the alcove, the paramedic who had been there that night, and who his daughter had recognized 3 years later in a hotel stairwell. Cole listened the way Cole listened, which was with his whole body, which had always been slightly exhausting and which Adrian had, over the years, come to recognize as one of his brother's better qualities. Where is she now? Cole asked. The paramedic. Working? She has jobs through Christmas. Cole looked at his coffee. Are you... He stopped, started again, in the way of a younger brother choosing words carefully around an older one. Are you involved with her? She's consulting on the Foundation's Recovery Center design, Adrian said. That's not what I asked. I know. Cole looked at him. Okay. I mean, I don't know, Adrian said. which was the most uncertain thing he'd said out loud to another person in probably years, and he was aware of it, and apparently so was Cole, who went very still in the way of someone who is trying not to react to something that is actually significant. "She knows what happened," Adrian said. "That night. She was there. She understands, not intellectually, but actually, and Emma trusts her." He paused. "That's complicated." "Why is it complicated?" "Because I don't want to confuse. I don't know what I feel about her separately from what she's done for Emma. And I'm not sure I'm capable right now of separating those things cleanly. And if I can't separate them, then whatever I feel might not be what I think it is." Cole was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of his sons did something that made something else fall over, and there was a brief exchange, and then silence again. "You know what you sound like right now?" Cole said. "Don't. You sound like someone who has spent 3 years managing everything from behind glass and has just noticed that one of the windows is open." He set down his coffee. "That's not a criticism. That's what it sounds like." Adrian looked at the window over the sink, the winter water beyond it. "She's difficult," he said, which was not quite the right word, and he knew it. What he meant was, she pushed back. She said no when she meant no, and yes when she meant yes. She didn't adjust herself to the room, and all of those things were specifically the things that made him trust her, and specifically the things that made her a person rather than a service. And the distinction mattered in ways he was still working out. "The difficult ones are usually the ones that are worth something," Cole said. "That's a greeting card sentiment. It's also true." Cole shrugged. "Both things." "What?" Olivia spent Christmas at her friend Dara's apartment in Fremont. Dara was a former colleague from the fire department, one of the few people Olivia had maintained real contact with from that part of her life, partly because Dara had a gift for staying in touch with people without making the maintenance feel like work, and partly because she made excellent tamales and genuinely didn't mind that Olivia was bad at conversation after 8 o'clock. There were 6 people at Dara's Christmas. Olivia knew 3 of them, tolerated one of them, and spent a pleasant hour talking to the 6th, who turned out to be a structural engineer named Paul, who had opinions about Pacific Northwest construction that aligned closely enough with Olivia's own to keep them occupied through 2 rounds of food and most of a bottle of wine. She did not think about Adrian Hale during Christmas dinner. She thought about him slightly during the drive home, but that was because she was passing through the waterfront district, and the mansion was roughly in the direction she was going, and her brain made the association automatically, which she logged without assigning it meaning. She thought about Emma. She thought about the drawing, now in the frame on the windowsill. She thought about the look on Emma's face in the living room when she'd slid the notebook across the floor. The particular quality of an act that was a gift in the full sense of the word, not just an object, but a choice. Back in the apartment, she sat on the couch with a glass of water and looked at the windowsill, the drawing in its frame, Tommy's photograph beside it, 2 different shapes of gone, side by side, and her life in the middle still going. She picked up the small notebook from the coffee table, the one from her jacket pocket, the measurements and supply lists and the library notes, and turned to the 3 pages of trauma-informed design research. She read through them again. Then she turned to a blank page and started sketching. Not the same sketch she'd made at Adrian's kitchen table. Something different. A thought about sound, about acoustic design, about how the specific noise frequency of an emergency vehicle had never fully left her nervous system even years after she'd stopped driving one, and what that suggested about what children in traumatic aftermath might be carrying in their bodies in ways that a beautiful room with correct lighting would never address. She wrote for an hour. The water glass sat untouched. The jazz station was off, and the apartment was quiet in the particular way it was quiet on holidays, which was quieter than regular quiet, with more texture. She was not, she told herself, building toward something. She was thinking. Thinking was allowed. Thinking cost nothing. She looked at the sketch she'd made. It was different from the one at Adrian's table. It was more specific, more technical in the areas where she'd taught herself what technical meant, and more deliberately imprecise in the areas where she knew the imprecision was actually the point. The deliberate roughness, the materials that didn't pretend to be something other than what they were. She put the notebook down. She looked at the drawing on the windowsill. She thought about what Dr. Samuels had said in the coffee shop about carrying things alone, about the weight that shifted when someone else knew what you were holding. She was not alone in what she was building.
That was a new feeling. Not a comfortable one exactly, but real in a way that discomfort usually was. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in a while, which she noted and did not overinterpret, because the line between noting something and attaching to it was one she'd spent considerable energy learning to walk. The 1st of January arrived with the particular blankness of a day that is supposed to mean something and mostly means that the city is quiet and the grocery stores are closed. Olivia stood at her kitchen counter at 9 in the morning and called Adrian Hale. He picked up on the first ring. "I'm ready to see the sights," she said. "All 11? Start with 3. The ones furthest along. I want to see what's salvageable and what needs to start over." "I can arrange that for next week. And I want to talk to someone who's been in a recovery space as a patient, or a parent of one, not just research, actual testimony." A pause. "I can find that. Then we'll talk about the retainer." "Okay." "I'm not promising this works," she said. "I'm not promising I'm the right person for this." "I know that," he said. I want that on the table." "It's on the table." She looked out the kitchen window. January 1st. The sky was doing the thing it did when the year was new and the weather hadn't decided yet. Suspended, possible, not committed to any particular version of itself. "Happy New Year," she said, which she hadn't meant to say. "Happy New Year, Olivia." She hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment, hands wrapped around her coffee mug, looking at the drawing on the windowsill and the year laid out ahead of her like a building she hadn't worked in yet. Bones unknown, history unclear, potential entirely open. She had learned, doing restoration, that the scariest moment was always the one before you understood the structure. Once you understood it, once you knew what had been there, what was still holding, what needed to come down before anything new could go up, the work was just work. Hard and specific and yours. She hadn't understood the structure of the next part yet. She was beginning to. The first site visit happened on a Tuesday in the second week of January, which was the kind of day that Seattle saved specifically for moments requiring clarity. Cold enough, to be honest, clear enough that the mountains showed on the horizon like they were trying to make a point about permanence. Marcus drove them in a company SUV, which Olivia had declined to comment on beyond noting that the heated seats were excessive for a 40-minute drive. And Adrian had said nothing because she was right, and also because he was beginning to understand that Olivia Carter's observations about excess were never quite criticism. They were more like the way a craftsperson notes when more material has been used than the job requires. Informational, precise, not personal. The first site was in Tacoma, a building that had been a medical office complex in a previous life, and was now, theoretically, being converted into a pediatric trauma recovery center. The architectural firm's project manager met them in the parking lot with a hard hat and the specific cautious energy of someone who has been told that their plans have problems, but hasn't been told by whom. His name was Bennett. He was 32, efficient, polite, and within 4 minutes of walking the space with Olivia, visibly uncertain in a way that his efficiency and politeness were not covering. Because Olivia walked the space differently than the people he was accustomed to walking spaces with. She didn't look at the ceiling heights first, or the structural elements, or the way the natural light moved through the existing window placements. She walked to the corners. She stood in them, one at a time, in the specific way that a person stands when they are testing something with their body rather than measuring it with a tool. She put her back against the walls. She crouched down to the floor level of a 6-year-old and looked at the room from there. Bennett watched this and looked at Adrian, who gave him the expression of a man who was not going to explain and didn't feel he needed to. "The intake corridor," Olivia said, from a crouch in the corner of what the plans designated as the primary therapeutic environment. "It's too long." "The length is dictated by the—" Bennett began. "I know why it's long. I read the plans." She stood up. "A child in acute distress being brought into this space for the first time will see a corridor that long as a passage they can't see the end of. That's not— Corridors are fine, but this one needs a turn in it. Something that breaks the visual tunnel, even a slight angle." She pointed at the wall. "Here. If you bring this wall 10 degrees, you get the angle and you don't lose the square footage in the therapeutic room." Bennett looked at the wall. He looked at his tablet, where presumably the plans lived. "That would affect the structural. The load-bearing element is here." She pointed 18 inches to the left. "You've got room." He looked at the wall again.
Then he looked at Adrian, not for permission exactly, more like the look of someone recalibrating something they'd thought was settled. "She's right," Adrian said, unnecessarily, because it was clearly already resolved in Bennett's expression.
They spent 3 hours in the building. By the end of it, Olivia had filled 12 pages of her notebook, and Bennett had stopped looking at Adrian for context and was addressing Olivia directly, which was the practical result of spending 3 hours watching someone be right about things in ways that were specific and demonstrable rather than aesthetic and arguable. On the drive back, Marcus was quiet in the front seat, in the way that Marcus was specifically quiet when he was processing something that would eventually emerge as a logistical recommendation. Adrian turned to Olivia, who was looking out the window at the winter landscape moving past. "Well, it's salvageable," she said. "The Tacoma site. Most of the structural decisions were fine. The problems are in the finishing and the flow design. That's correctable." She turned back from the window. "The second site, the one in Bellevue. I want to see the existing foundation work before I say anything about it, because from the plans it looks like they've already poured on decisions I'd have questions about. We can go Thursday. I have a job Thursday morning. I can do afternoon." He nodded. She turned back to the window. Outside, the interstate moved through a stretch of industrial landscape, warehouses, storage yards, a stretch of chain-link fence along a drainage canal. The kind of landscape that wasn't beautiful and wasn't trying to be. "That project manager," she said. "Bennett. What about him?" "He's good. He just hasn't been given the right question to work from." She paused. "Most of the people working on these sites are good. They know their field. The problem is their field doesn't include the specific thing these spaces need, which is knowledge that comes from being in the moment rather than studying the moment. That's not a criticism of them. It's just a gap, which you fill." "Which I'm learning to fill," she said, correcting him in the way she always corrected imprecision. "There's a difference." He looked at the side of her face. She was watching the drainage canal, something about it apparently worth watching. Her jaw was set in its characteristic way, not tense exactly, more like someone who was always slightly braced against the possibility that the next thing would require steadiness, and had built the bracing in permanently. He wanted to say something. Several things, actually. Things that had been accumulating in the category of things he noticed about Olivia Carter that were not related to her professional observations or her value to the Foundation's project or her relationship with Emma. Things in a different category that he had been managing carefully because the managing was the right thing to do, and also because he was genuinely unsure what was in that category, and what was the gratitude, and what was the proximity, and what was something else entirely. He looked back out his own window. "The Bellevue site has a significant acoustic problem," Marcus said from the front seat, apparently finished processing. "I should have flagged it earlier. The HVAC placement creates a low-frequency hum in the eastern section of the building that probably won't be detectable until the systems are running." Olivia half turned toward the front. "How do you know about the acoustic problem?" "I asked the mechanical engineer. He mentioned it in passing as a minor issue." "It's not a minor issue," she said. "No," Marcus agreed. "I'm going to call them tomorrow." She turned back to her window. The canal was gone now, replaced by the first suburban sprawl of the outskirts. "Marcus," she said after a moment. "Yes?" "You're very useful." "I'm aware," he said, entirely without vanity. In the back seat, Adrian said nothing. But the corner of his mouth moved slightly, which was the closest he came to a smile on days when he was working. The thing that cracked the careful management happened in February, on a Wednesday afternoon that had started ordinarily enough. Emma had been doing well by the measure that Dr. Samuels had established, which was specifically not a linear progression, but a deepening, a widening of what was possible. She was talking more in school, which her teacher had reported with barely contained excitement in an email that Adrian had read 3 times. She was asking questions. She was, on 2 separate occasions, loud, not in distress, but in the regular way of a child expressing enthusiasm, a sound so unfamiliar in the Hale mansion that Mrs. Delgado had initially come to check if something was wrong. On this particular Wednesday, Emma had decided she wanted to build something. This was new. The drawing notebooks remained a constant. She filled 2 pages a day with the same precision and the same slightly too serious concentration. But the building impulse was different. It arrived like the other things arrived with Emma, which was without announcement, as a fully formed fact.
"I want to build a house," she told Olivia, when Olivia arrived at 2:30 with her jacket still smelling of the Bellevue site, concrete dust in her hair. Olivia looked at her. "What kind of house?" Emma considered. "Small," she said, "with a roof, as opposed to a house without a roof." "Those are incomplete," Emma said, with a severity that was entirely genuine and entirely 6 years old.
Olivia looked at Adrian, who was leaning against the doorframe. He raised his eyebrows in the particular way that said, "This is new and I have no additional information for you." "We could build a small house," Olivia said. "What do you want to use?" Emma looked at the living room, at the coffee table, the bookshelves, the architectural objects that decorated the Hale mansion with the restraint of expensive taste. None of these were right. Olivia could see it in the expression, the inventory and the dismissal. "Wood," Emma said. "Real wood?" "Real wood." She said it with the same certainty that Olivia used when talking about materials, the certainty of someone who already knew the difference between the thing and its imitation. 2 days later, Olivia arrived with the back of the Strand restoration van loaded with cedar offcuts from a job she'd finished the previous week. Scrap pieces mostly, short lengths that would have gone in the bin. She'd sorted through the bin at the end of the job and asked Martinez if she could take the best ones. And Martinez, who had known Olivia for 3 years and didn't require extensive explanation of her choices, had said obviously. The cedar was good wood, straight grain, clean smell, the kind that worked easily under small hands and smelled right when you worked it. She'd brought a small handsaw, 3 sizes of sandpaper, wood glue, and a set of clamps that were old enough to have opinions about angles. She and Emma built on the back patio, the covered section, where the January weather couldn't reach them directly. But the cold air came in at the edges and smelled like the water. Adrian watched from inside for the first 20 minutes, and then came out with 2 coffees and sat on the steps, which put him close but not in the middle of it, which was the calibration he'd developed for being near Emma and Olivia when they were working together. Present enough to be available, far enough that the space was theirs. Emma was not a natural with the hand tools. She held the small saw too lightly at first, which Olivia corrected by physically placing Emma's hand in the right position without making a production of the correction, and then Emma cut with more authority and looked surprised at how well it worked. "You have to mean it," Olivia said. "The saw does the work, but you have to mean it." Emma tried again. The cedar gave way cleanly. She held up the cut piece and looked at it with the expression she used for things that had met her standard. "Good," she said. They worked for 2 hours. Olivia didn't design the house. She answered questions when Emma had them and suggested solutions when Emma hit structural problems she couldn't solve alone, but she didn't take the work away from her. The result was a small cedar structure approximately 12 inches tall, with a pitched roof that was slightly uneven on one side, and a doorway that was technically too wide for the proportions, but which Emma had insisted on because she said it needed to let the air in. She wasn't wrong. The slightly too wide doorway made the small structure feel open in a way that the correct proportions wouldn't have. Adrian looked at it and thought, not for the first time, that his daughter understood something about space that she hadn't learned from anyone in particular and hadn't lost in the accident. It had been there before. It was still there now, beneath the silence that was slowly, unevenly lifting. "Can we put it somewhere?" Emma asked. She was looking at the small house with the same evaluative attention she gave everything she made. "Where do you want to put it?" Olivia asked. Emma looked at the garden. It was January, and the garden was the January version of itself, the bones of things, the shapes without the details. She pointed to the corner where the cedar fence met the back wall, a sheltered spot that got morning light and was protected on 2 sides. "There," she said. They carried it together, which required 3 trips and 1 near disaster with the roof and a considerable amount of Emma-directed logistical commentary, and they set it in the corner Emma had chosen, and Emma crouched down in front of it and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has put a thing exactly where it belongs. Adrian, from where he stood, watched his daughter's face. He felt, in his chest, the thing he'd felt in the doorway on the night she first asked for cereal, something that hadn't earned its name yet, something that was more than relief and less than the full version of what it was reaching toward. He felt it, and he looked at Olivia, who was crouched next to Emma, and saying something about the grain direction of the cedar. And he had the particular experience of looking at a person and understanding something about them that you hadn't understood before. Not because they'd done anything new, but because you'd finally caught up to something that had been true for a while. He looked away before she could notice he was looking. He was not good at this. He had been, before Sarah, not exactly good at it, but better at it. Better at the movement between what he felt and what he let exist in the open. 3 years of keeping himself sealed and functional had not improved the skill. If anything, it had made the distance between the inside and the outside wider, more established, harder to cross. He went inside and washed his coffee mug and thought about other things. The conversation that broke the careful management happened 3 weeks after that, on a day that had been going wrong since early morning. The Bellevue site had encountered a problem that was larger than the acoustic issue. A subcontractor had poured a section of flooring incorrectly, a mistake that wasn't catastrophic but that required tearing out and redoing work already billed, which opened a dispute with the construction management firm that Marcus was handling, and which was exactly the kind of institutional friction that Olivia had warned about in December when she'd looked at the contract structures. She hadn't phrased it as a warning. She'd made an observation about the way liability was distributed, and Adrian had nodded and Marcus had made notes, and nobody had resolved the underlying structural problem, and now it had become a dispute. Olivia had spent 4 hours on a call with Bennett, the project manager, and 2 representatives from the construction firm, walking through the technical specifics of what had gone wrong and what the remediation would require. She was not the project manager. She was not contracted for dispute resolution. But she was the person who understood the technical decisions that had led to the mistake. And Bennett had asked if she'd be willing to be on the call, and she'd said yes because the alternative was letting people who didn't understand the decision make the case about it. By the time the call ended, she was tired in the specific way that comes from 4 hours of being the most informed person in a room and having to demonstrate it incrementally without alienating anyone. She drove to the Hale mansion for the standing Wednesday visit with her jaw tight and her shoulders somewhere around her earlobes. Emma was at a school event. Adrian had mentioned it on Monday, an afternoon concert, the school's winter music program. And Olivia had gone to the mansion out of habit, momentarily blanked on the fact that Emma wasn't there, and was standing in the kitchen accepting Mrs. Delgado's coffee when Adrian came in and reminded her. "She's at the concert until 4, he said. "Mrs. Delgado's picking her up." "Right." Olivia looked at the coffee. She'd forgotten. That wasn't like her, Shag. She kept track of the things she needed to keep track of with a reliability that was about more than just organization. It was about not letting anything fall, because falling things had consequences she didn't have room for. Forgetting the concert schedule felt like a symptom of something. "You can wait if you want," Adrian said, "or come back." "I'll wait," she said, because driving back across the city and then back again was 40 minutes. She didn't want to spend in the van thinking about the Bellevue dispute. They ended up in the kitchen. Mrs. Delgado disappeared in the considerate way that Mrs. Delgado disappeared when the kitchen was occupied by people who weren't going to need her for a while, leaving the coffee and a plate of something she'd baked that Olivia didn't examine too closely because she was going to eat it regardless. The kitchen was quiet. The water was gray through the window. Adrian leaned against the counter on his side and Olivia sat on the high stool on hers, and for a few minutes it was just the particular comfortable quiet of 2 people who had been in the same vicinity often enough that the silence didn't require filling. "The Bellevue call was bad," he said. He'd seen it in her face when she walked in. It was 4 hours of people negotiating about a mistake that shouldn't have happened. "Marcus is working on the contract issue." "The contract issue is a symptom." She put her elbows on the counter. "The underlying problem is that the construction management firm doesn't understand that what we're building isn't standard commercial space. They're applying standard quality benchmarks to a specialized application, and the benchmarks are wrong." She looked at her coffee. "I said this in December." "You did. I'm not saying I told you so. I'm saying the problem needs to be addressed structurally, or we're going to have the same conversation at 5 of the remaining sites." "I know." He paused. "What would you need to address it structurally?" "A contract amendment that defines the specialized requirements as primary specifications rather than supplementary guidance, and someone who can hold the construction managers accountable to those specs on site, not just on paper." "You." "I'm not..." I can't be on site for 11 projects simultaneously while also doing the design consulting. Not you alone. He straightened slightly, the way he straightened when something was moving from the conceptual to the operational, the particular posture of someone who is about to make a decision. What if we formalize the whole thing? Not a consulting agreement, a company, yours, with the foundation as the primary client and you hiring the people you need to execute the site work. She looked at him.
You'd need to build it from the ground up, he said. I know that. Staff, operations, all of it. But you'd have the foundation contracts as an anchor client, which solves the cash flow problem for the first 2 years at minimum. That's a significant yes. You're talking about a real company, not Strand Restoration with a side project. Strand Restoration is Martinez and 2-day laborers, he said, not unkindly. What I'm describing is something different. Olivia was quiet. She looked at the counter between them. She'd had the thought. She'd been having the version of the thought that she was allowed to have, the planning edition, the hypothetical. Not this version, not the one that was apparently being handed to her on a Tuesday afternoon in someone else's kitchen. Why? She said. He looked at her. Why what? Why are you doing this? She kept her voice even, informational, not, I understand the business logic. I can see the logic. I'm asking about the rest of it, because this is more than the foundation needs. You could fix the Bellevue problem tomorrow with a contract amendment and a competent construction manager and a less expensive consultant. The thing you're describing is something else. He was quiet for a moment. Through the window, a seagull tracked across the gray sky in a long diagonal. Because you've been trying to hold a leaking thing together with both hands for 2 years, he said. And you're good enough at it that nobody looking at you would know how much it costs. But I've been watching you do it since November, and I know. He paused. And because what you're doing with Emma and with these sites, what you bring to it, is not the kind of thing that should be squeezed into the margins of someone else's restoration jobs. It deserves its own structure. Olivia looked at him for a long moment. That's the most I've heard you say that wasn't about logistics, she said. I know. He didn't look away. She pressed her lips together. The thing in her chest that she'd been managing carefully, the thing that had a shape she recognized and hadn't wanted to name, moved. I need to think about it, she said. Take whatever time you need. I'm not saying no. I know. I'm also not saying yes yet. I know that too. She looked at her coffee. The seagull outside had gone wherever seagulls went. The kitchen was very quiet. You've known me for 3 months, she said. 2.5. That's not a lot of time to know someone well enough to I know. He stopped her gently. I'm not saying I know you completely. I'm saying I know enough to know that I'm not wrong about this. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen 3 or 4 times. Not the CEO expression, not the grieving father expression, not the carefully managed public version of Adrian Hale. The expression underneath all of those, the one that appeared when he'd stopped performing and was just being in the room with her. Emma's not the only one you've helped, he said. It was quiet and it was direct, and it was the closest either of them had come to saying the actual thing. Olivia looked at the counter again. She wasn't good at this either. She'd been good at it once, with Tommy, and losing it had been part of what losing Tommy meant, and she hadn't been sure for a long time that the capacity was still there, or if it had gone with him. It was still there. She could feel that clearly enough. The question was what to do with the information. I need to think, she said again. Okay. About all of it. A pause. Okay. She finished her coffee. She was staring at the counter when Emma came through the back door with Mrs. Delgado, cold-cheeked from the car and carrying a piece of paper that turned out to be a program from the school concert that she'd colored on during the performance. Small, precise stars drawn in every available margin. The same star configuration she always drew, dense and deliberate, and entirely her own. She handed the program to Olivia when she came into the kitchen without preamble, the way she handed things to Olivia now. As a matter of course, as the natural destination of things she wanted to share. Olivia took it and looked at the stars in the margins. How was the concert? Emma considered. Loud, she said, but the good kind. What's the good kind? When the loud is on purpose. Olivia looked at her. Emma looked back with those 2 serious eyes that had been slowly, over the months, letting something warmer through.
That's a useful distinction, Olivia said. Emma nodded, satisfied, and went to find Mrs. Delgado about a snack. Olivia looked at the concert program in her hands, the stars in the margins. She looked up and found Adrian watching her from across the kitchen, and neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of saying something. Then she called Martinez that evening. He answered on the third ring, in the middle of something that sounded like a television program with significant explosions. "Hey, what's up?" "I need to talk to you about something," she said. The television got quieter. Martinez had known Olivia long enough to know the difference between the calls that were logistics and the ones that were actual things. "Okay, talk." She told him about the foundation offer, the whole shape of it, the company structure, the anchor contract, what it would mean for Strand restoration, and what it would mean for her. She told him about the sites. She told him about Emma and Dr. Samuels and the design work she'd been doing, which she'd mentioned to him in pieces but not as a whole. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end that was Martinez thinking, which was different from Martinez being quiet because he had nothing to say. He was almost never quiet because he had nothing to say. "So you'd be starting your own thing," he said, "potentially, and leaving Strand." "Strand would keep running. You'd take it over. You've been running it operationally for 2 years anyway. I've been running the jobs. You've been running everything else." "I'd help you set up the everything else before I left." She paused. "If I left." "Olivia." His voice had the particular quality it got when he was being direct with her, which he did rarely and therefore effectively. "Is this the right thing?" "I don't know." "Is it what you want?" She looked at the drawing on the windowsill, the stars, the road, the frame she'd gotten from Tommy's box. "I think it might be," she said. "I'm scared of that." "Why scared?" "Because wanting things is... I got out of the habit." Martinez was quiet for a moment. "You know what you were like when Tommy died? You came back to work after 3 weeks. 3 weeks, and I tried to tell you to take more time, and you told me working was the only thing that kept you moving forward." He paused. "You've been moving forward for 2 years. Moving forward is not the same as going somewhere." She pressed her lips together. He was right. He was frequently right about the simple version of things that she had complicated into something she couldn't see clearly. "If this is where you're trying to go," he said, "then go. I'll figure out the rest. You'll need someone for the estimating. I'll hire someone who actually estimates instead of guessing and hoping. That's not what you do. It's a little bit what I do." She exhaled, something almost like a laugh. "A little bit? Go do your thing, Carter. Some of us have explosions to watch." She hung up. She sat for a moment. Then she opened the small notebook to a blank page and wrote, "Things a new company would need." And then she wrote under it for 45 minutes, filling the page and most of the next one with the mixture of practical necessity and larger possibility that a thing needs when it's moving from thought to real. She told Adrian yes on a Friday morning in early February, standing in his office for the first time. She'd been in the kitchen, the living room, the back patio, but not the office, which occupied a corner of the upper floor and faced the water on 2 sides, and was the kind of space that said things about the person who worked in it. It said, "This person is organized and doesn't need to perform it. This person has money and doesn't need to prove it. This person thinks better when the horizon is visible." She stood in the middle of the room and said yes to the company's structure and yes to the contract terms that Marcus had drafted and that she'd spent 3 evenings going through line by line with a degree of attention that Marcus had apparently reported back to Adrian because when she arrived, Adrian had already incorporated 3 changes without her asking. "The timeline is realistic?" he asked when she'd finished. "For the first 3 sites. The later ones we'll need to assess as we get there." "Fair." He put the contract on his desk. "I want to ask you something that's not about the contract." She'd known it was coming. She'd been knowing it was coming for 3 weeks, the way you know weather is coming when the pressure changes. "Okay," she said. He looked at her directly, which was how he always said the things that mattered. "I don't know what this is. Between us, I don't know if it's something I've constructed out of what you've done for Emma and what you've done for the work and how much time we've spent in the same rooms. I don't know if it's real or if I have not been good these past 3 years at knowing what's real versus what I want to be real." She held his gaze. "And?" And I'm not going to do anything about it without telling you that it exists. Because you're now under contract with the foundation, and I'm aware of what that means for the balance of this. And the last thing I want is to make you feel like anything you do here is leveraged against anything. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her that wanted to make a small joke, to ease the weight of what he'd just said, and she didn't, because he'd said it without armor on, and that deserved something equivalent. I know the difference, she said, between something that's leveraged and something that's not. I've known the difference for a while. Okay. I'm not ready, she said. For whatever this is to be something named, I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm saying I need it to stay where it is for now. That's fine. It's not about you specifically, she said, and heard how that sounded and corrected it. I mean, it is about you, but it's also about me. I've been in enough of a building project lately that adding another one feels too much. Too soon. She paused. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. Too soon I can work with. Don't make that sound simpler than it is. I'm not. He said it quietly, and she believed him, and that was itself something. The fact that she believed him, specifically, which was not something she extended automatically to people who wanted things from her. Outside the office windows, the water was doing the February version of itself. Rougher than December, more decisive, the gray turned slightly blue. She looked at it for a moment, the horizon he'd arranged his workspace to face. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Emma, before the accident, what was she like? He looked slightly caught off guard, which was rare. He sat back. She was loud, he said after a moment. She sang constantly. These little made-up songs that didn't have words yet, just sounds. She was always moving. She had this thing where she'd run at me when I came home from work, like she was going to stop at the last second, and then she never did. She always crashed into me, and I always caught her. He stopped. His expression had gone somewhere private and then came back. She had Sarah's laugh, exactly Sarah's laugh. I'd forgotten, in the silence, how loud she could be. Olivia was quiet. And now? She asked. Now she's different. She's quieter by nature still. Dr. Samuel says some of that is just who she is now, that the trauma changed some things in ways that aren't reversible, and the work is about building around those changes rather than erasing them. He looked at the water. But she sang something last week, just a few notes, in the kitchen. She thought no one heard. Olivia felt something happen in her chest. Did you say anything? No. I stood on the other side of the door and I listened, and then I went back to my office and I sat there for 20 minutes. He paused. She has Sarah's laugh, but the singing is hers. It's entirely hers. Olivia picked up the contract from his desk and put it in her bag. I'll have this back to you on Monday, she said, meaning the signed copy. Take whatever time you need. I've thought about it long enough. She moved toward the door and then stopped. She looked at him over her shoulder. The particular angle, she realized, that he'd first seen her at, in the hotel alcove, when she'd been half-turned and had made the calculation about whether to stay or go. She's going to be okay, Olivia said. Emma, not the same as before, but okay. Her own version of it. She said it not as comfort exactly. She wasn't in the business of offering comfort she didn't mean, but as information, an honest assessment, the kind she'd make about a building she'd walked through carefully and understood. Adrian looked at her. I know, he said. And for the first time, the way he said those two words didn't sound like the repetition of something he was trying to convince himself of. It sounded like something he actually believed. She left. On the drive back to her apartment, she thought about what Martinez had said. Moving forward is not the same as going somewhere. She thought about the distinction and about the fact that for the first time in 2 years, she could feel the difference between the two in her body. The difference between the motion that was just continuation and the motion that was direction. She stopped at the hardware store on her way home. She needed specific things: brass fittings, a particular weight of sandpaper, materials for a small project she'd been planning that had nothing to do with the foundation contracts or the site visits. She'd been thinking about building something for Emma, not a house. Emma had built her own house, and it was in the corner of the garden where she'd chosen, and it was hers.
Something different, something that started from the same place the cedar wood and the old clamps and the slightly too wide doorway had started, from the question of what a child needed to feel safe enough to be fully herself inside a space. She picked up the brass fittings and the sandpaper and a length of cedar rope, and she drove home through the February afternoon with the specific purposefulness of someone who has stopped moving forward and started, for the first time in a long time, going somewhere. The treehouse took 11 weeks to build. Olivia hadn't planned 11 weeks. She'd planned 6, maybe 7, accounting for weather and the fact that she was building it on weekends and occasional weekday afternoons around the foundation site work, which had expanded in ways that were demanding and necessary, and that she was still, some mornings, slightly astonished to be responsible for. But the treehouse kept revealing new requirements as it went, the way real things did, the way buildings always did when you were building them honestly rather than just building them fast. She'd chosen the cedar tree at the back corner of the Hale Properties garden. It was an old tree, thick through the middle, with a branch structure that was practically architectural in how it arranged itself. 3 main branches spreading at almost equal angles from the trunk at a height of about 8 feet, creating a natural platform opportunity that a builder would have been embarrassed not to use. She'd looked at it the first time she'd walked the garden with Adrian back in November, and the thought had arrived then. But she hadn't said anything because it was November and she was still deciding whether she was the kind of person who said those kinds of things out loud. By February, she was that kind of person. Or she was becoming her. She told Adrian in the kitchen one Wednesday, in the straightforward way she'd adopted for telling him things. Not with preamble, not with the performance of presenting an idea, just the idea itself. I want to build Emma a treehouse in the cedar. He looked at her. Then out the window at the cedar tree, then back at her. Okay, he said. I'll need access on weekends. I'll need to leave materials in the garage. Done. And I want Emma involved, not in the construction, not the structural parts, but in the decisions. He nodded. What do you need from me? Stay out of it, she said without cruelty. Not entirely, but mostly. It should be between me and her. He stayed out of it. That cost him something. She could see, on the Saturdays she arrived and he was somewhere inside the house making himself absent from the garden, the specific quality of restraint that looked like someone holding a door closed from the other side. But he did it, because Adrian Hale, underneath the instinct to manage and direct and push, was a person who understood when the right thing was the harder thing. Emma came to every session. She didn't help in the ways a normal 6-year-old might help, enthusiastically, chaotically, requiring supervision to prevent injury and creative disasters. She helped in the way she did everything, which was with deliberate attention and specific opinions. She had thoughts about the railing height. She had thoughts about where the window should face. She had extended and considered thoughts about the roof pitch, which she'd discussed with Olivia over 2 separate sessions before reaching a conclusion that was structurally sound and aesthetically right, and that Olivia suspected Emma had known from the beginning and had simply wanted to talk through. Why does the window face east? Adrian asked once, the one time Olivia had let him come close enough to look. Emma wanted morning light, Olivia said. Why? Olivia looked at him. You should ask her. He did. Emma looked at him with her gap-toothed seriousness and said, Because morning is when things start. I want to see when things start. He didn't say anything to that. He went back inside and Olivia went back to the railing, and neither of them made a production of the fact that those were possibly the most revealing 11 words his daughter had said out loud in 3.5 years. The treehouse was finished on a Saturday in early May. Not polished, the cedar was raw and would weather silver over time the way cedar does. And the railing had one section that was slightly off plumb, because Emma had been very clear about the angle, and Olivia had respected the clarity, and the roof overhung on the east side by 6 inches more than the west, because the east side was the window side, and Emma had wanted the rain to sound different on that side. Emma climbed up the ladder, 8 rungs, rope-assisted, her own design for the handrail, and went inside and didn't come back down for 20 minutes. When she did come down, she looked at Olivia with the expression she used for things that had met her standard. It's right, she said. Good, Olivia said. Emma looked at the treehouse for a moment more. Then she looked at Olivia. Will you come up? Olivia looked at the ladder. 8 rungs and a platform that she'd built to hold the weight of 2 adults because she'd built it correctly. Yeah, she said. I'll come up.
They sat in the treehouse together, Emma cross-legged with her notebook, Olivia with her back against the trunk wall, the east window open to the May afternoon. The garden below was doing the May version of itself, which was the best version, everything making an effort, the particular green that only existed in the Pacific Northwest in spring, a color that was almost too saturated to be real. Emma drew. Olivia didn't say anything. The cedar smelled right, the raw kind, the kind that was still the tree it came from. After a while, Emma said, without looking up from the notebook, "Are you going to stay?" Olivia looked at her. "Stay where?" "Here." Emma's pencil moved. "Not the treehouse. Here." She made a small gesture that encompassed, apparently, the garden and the house and the general territory of this particular life. Olivia was quiet for a moment. She thought about the careful answer, the one that honored the complexity, that didn't promise more than she knew, that protected both of them from the specific disappointment of an overcommitted word. She thought about Emma asking for cereal and the drawing on her windowsill, and Martinez saying moving forward is not the same as going somewhere. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to stay." Emma nodded, like she'd already known, and was just confirming the paperwork. They stayed in the treehouse until the light changed. The thing between Olivia and Adrian did not resolve itself neatly or on schedule, because it was not a project and it could not be managed like one, which was something both of them had to keep relearning. What happened was slower and less dramatic than either of them might have imagined if they'd been imagining it, which they both were and both would have denied. What happened was accumulation, the specific accumulation of ordinary moments that add up to something extraordinary without any individual moment announcing itself as significant. It was Adrian showing up at the Tacoma site in March with lunch he hadn't mentioned he was bringing, and the two of them eating it on the front steps of the building in the cold while Bennett's crew worked inside, and the conversation moving through the site work and into something else without either of them marking the transition. It was Olivia staying for dinner on a Wednesday in April because Mrs. Delgado had made enough for 4, and leaving to go home felt arbitrary in a way she couldn't justify. Emma had sat between them at the table and talked about a book her school tutor had given her, a picture book about a crow who couldn't fly but could do other things. And Adrian had asked questions, and Olivia had asked questions, and the dinner had lasted 90 minutes, and nobody had checked the time. It was a Sunday in late April when the Foundation's 4th site, a conversion project in Olympia, hit a problem that required immediate site presence, and Adrian drove down with Olivia because the decision needed both of them, and 4 hours in a car is 4 hours in a car. And by the time they'd solved the Olympia problem and driven back, it was 10:30 at night, and they'd talked for most of the drive about things that had nothing to do with the Foundation, or Emma, or the careful structures they'd built around what they were to each other. He told her about his father, who had been the kind of man who built things and never explained why he'd built them, who had left Adrian a single shipping dock and a set of principles about negotiation, and died before Adrian was 30 without ever once saying he was proud of what Adrian had done with the inheritance. Olivia had listened to this without offering a corrective interpretation, without saying he probably was proud, because she understood that some absences don't get reframed and shouldn't be, and the honest thing was to sit with them. She told him about Tommy, not the death. She'd mentioned the death before, the facts of it. She told him about who Tommy actually was, which was different. The way Tommy laughed too loud in movie theaters and didn't care who looked. The way he'd learned to cook during his treatment because he said it was the one thing that required you to be entirely in the present moment or the thing burned. The specific smell of the old flannel shirt she'd kept, which she'd finally stopped wearing but couldn't throw out, which was in a box on the top shelf of the closet and which she visited occasionally, not out of grief exactly, but out of the same impulse that made her keep certain old tools, the ones that had done good work, that deserved to be remembered. Adrian had listened to that the way he listened to things that mattered, without filling the space after, without offering the equivalence of his own loss in exchange. Just listened, which was, Olivia had discovered, harder for him than almost anything else, and therefore more meaningful when he did it. They got back to Seattle at 11:15. He walked her to the Strand van in the parking structure, a habit that had developed without announcement, and they stood in the concrete quiet of the structure for a moment in the specific suspension of a moment that both people know has a choice in it. He said, "I know you said too soon." She said, "I know what I said." He looked at her. She looked at him. "It's May."
she said.
It is. February was too soon, she said. May is a different thing. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He just looked at her the way he looked at her when he was being the version of himself that had stopped performing, and she looked back at him the same way, and they stood in the parking structure in the fluorescent light for another moment that was its own kind of saying something. What happened was ordinary and human and imperfect and entirely theirs. Two people who had been carrying heavy things alone for a long time, standing close enough to share the weight. It was not a perfect beginning. She had history in her, and he had history in him, and those histories were going to collide in ways they couldn't entirely predict yet. She was not easy to know, and he was not easy to be around, and neither of them had any illusions about the amount of work that lived on the other side of this. But the work was not the same as the weight. She knew that now, the difference. The work was something you moved through. The weight was something that moved through you. She drove home through the May City with the windows down, which she never did in November or February or even April, because Seattle's spring was not reliably warm enough for open windows. But May was different. May made the effort. The first Carter-designed recovery center opened in September. It was the Tacoma site, the one that was salvageable, the one where she'd crouched in the corner and understood immediately what was wrong. The building that resulted from those months of work was not a showpiece. It was not the kind of architecture that appeared in journals, which was fine, which was actually the point. It was a building that understood its job. The corridors had the turn she'd put in, the slight angle that broke the tunnel, that gave a frightened child something to move toward rather than an intimidating passage to get through. The primary therapeutic rooms had the zone design, the high ceiling section for children who needed space, and the lower angled corner for children who needed to disappear into something. The sensory materials were real materials. Cedar panels that had texture under fingers, a plaster section that was deliberately rough in specific places, a floor that was warm underfoot because she'd understood that cold floors were not neutral, they were a message. The acoustic design had been her longest fight with the architectural firm, and she had won it. And the result was a building that was quiet in the specific way she'd been working toward. Not dead quiet, not soundproofed into the clinical silence of a medical facility, but layered quiet. The kind where you could hear what was near you and the far sounds were softened to a distance that made them non-threatening. Dr. Samuels came to the opening. She walked through the building slowly, the way she walked through everything, with her whole attention. And when she came back to the entry hall where Olivia was standing with a small glass of something she'd barely touched, the therapist looked at her with an expression that Olivia had only seen once before, which was in the coffee shop on Capitol Hill when she'd said, "I think it might be lighter if someone else knew what you were carrying." "You built it from the inside out," Dr. Samuels said. "That's the only way to build something that works." "I know. It's also the hardest way." She paused. "There's a child coming in next week, 7 years old, car accident, nonverbal for 8 months. I'm going to use the East Room." Olivia thought about the East Room, the corner unit, the one with the lower ceiling section and the cedar panels and the window that faced the garden outside. "Let me know how it goes," she said. "I will." The opening was not a gala. It was intentionally small. The foundation's board, a few local officials, the medical partners, the construction team. Marcus had suggested a larger event, and Adrian had said no, which Olivia had agreed with before he'd even finished the sentence, and Marcus had accepted this with the equanimity of someone who had learned over many months. When the two of them were going to agree before anyone had spoken, Adrian gave a short statement that nothing ceremonial, nothing that tried to make the building into a monument to anything. He talked about what the foundation was trying to do, which was not to build impressive spaces but to build functional ones, and about what that distinction meant in practice, which was harder and less glamorous and more necessary. He didn't mention Emma by name, but toward the end he said, "The knowledge that shaped this building didn't come from research, though the research was important. It came from someone who understood, from experience, that safety is not a design feature, it's a lived condition. And creating it in a built space requires knowing what it feels like to need it, not just what it looks like on a plan." Olivia stood in the back of the room and looked at the floor. Bennett, the project manager, was standing near her. He leaned slightly in her direction without fully turning. "He's talking about you," he said quietly. "He talks about a lot of things," she said. Bennett looked at her. He had over the months of working together, developed the specific regard of someone who had been shown repeatedly that they didn't know as much as they thought and had chosen to learn rather than defend. It had made him better at his job. It had also made him, Olivia thought, a genuinely decent person to work with, which was not the same thing, but was related. The second site, he said, the Bellevue one. I went back and looked at the acoustic notes from January. You were right about all of it. I know, she said. He almost smiled. Of course you do. After the event, when the small crowd had thinned to the people who were staying to help with the cleanup, which was a shorter list than at most events because Olivia had specifically designed the post-event logistics so that the building didn't get overwhelmed by the after-party of its own opening, she walked through the building alone. She did it the way she always walked through finished buildings, the way that was more like a conversation than an inspection. She moved through each room slowly, putting her hand against the walls in places, standing in the corners, sitting on the floor of the East Room's lower section, and looking up at the ceiling from the height a child would see it. It was right, not perfect. There were 3 things she'd change if she were starting over, and she kept a list of such things in her notebook as a record of what each project taught her. But it was right in the way that mattered, which was that a frightened child in this space would find what they needed. The corner that fit around a body, the texture that answered back when you pressed your hands against it, the quiet that held rather than isolated. She sat in the East Room corner for a few minutes in the September evening light and thought about a woman she'd never met who had asked about her daughter from the front seat of a car, and a 6-year-old who had held 7 words inside herself for 3 years, like a key she couldn't find the lock for, and a hotel alcove in November where everything had been waiting, apparently, to come together. She didn't assign it meaning beyond what it was. She was not someone who needed the universe to have been arranging things. She just thought, this is what happened, and this is what it made. She got up, turned off the East Room light, and went out to where Adrian was waiting in the parking lot with his jacket over his arm, and the expression of someone who had been patient longer than it cost him, and had done it without complaint. How is it? He asked. It's good, she said. It's what it needs to be. He nodded. She fell into step beside him, and they walked out into the September evening together, which was ordinary and not ordinary at all. Emma turned 7 in October. The birthday party was small by design, Emma's design specifically, because Emma had thoughts about the scale of things and had communicated those thoughts clearly enough that no one had pushed back. 6 children from school, the garden, the treehouse available as a destination for whoever wanted it. She had a voice now, not the pre-accident voice, not the loud, always moving child who'd crashed into her father's arms at the end of every workday. Dr. Samuels had been honest about that in ways that Adrian had needed time to absorb. Some things that the silence had changed were changed. Emma would always be more internal than she'd been before. She would always have the particular awareness of someone who had learned very early that the world could rearrange itself without warning, and that knowledge lived in her body even on the days it wasn't in the front of her mind. But she was here. She was fully, specifically, her own version of here. She had opinions about everything. She had ongoing and earnest thoughts about the structural adequacy of various natural phenomena. She had recently decided that she wanted to learn to play the cello, not because of the school music program, but because she'd heard someone playing one on a recording that her tutor had put on during a lesson, and she'd made her tutor play it 4 times before she'd said, with the certainty she brought to things that were decided, that's the one. She talked to Adrian now. Really talked. Not just the functional requests that had been the first language she'd rebuilt, but actual conversation, the kind that went sideways and came back and surprised both of them. They still had the particular awkwardness of a father and daughter who had spent 3 years on opposite sides of a wall and were learning each other again, and sometimes it was halting, and sometimes one of them said something wrong and had to repair it, and it was imperfect and necessary and entirely real. He had apologized to her. Not in a prepared speech, not with the formal weight of something he'd workshopped with Dr. Samuels, though he'd mentioned to the therapist that he was thinking about it, and she'd said when it feels right, not when it feels necessary. It had happened on a Thursday evening when Emma was in the kitchen doing her homework, and he'd come in and been watching her for a moment, and she'd looked up and said, with the directness she'd inherited from somewhere, "What?" And he'd sat down across from her and said, "I wasn't here enough. After your mom died. I didn't know how to be here, and I made myself busy instead, and I'm sorry." Emma had looked at him for a long moment with those two serious eyes. "I know," she said. "I know you know. I wanted to say it anyway." She'd considered this. Then she'd returned to her homework and said, without looking up, "You're here now," which was not forgiveness exactly, because it wasn't something that required forgiving. It was something that required acknowledging and had been acknowledged. And Emma at 7 was sophisticated enough about the architecture of difficult things to know the difference. He'd stayed in the kitchen until her homework was done, and they'd made dinner together, badly, in his case, adequately in hers, because Mrs. Delgado had been teaching Emma to cook on Wednesday mornings, and Emma had developed opinions about technique. And it was the first time he could remember in years that the kitchen had felt like a room where people lived rather than a room where they passed through. At Emma's birthday party, Olivia arrived with a gift she'd made rather than bought. She didn't make presents as a general rule. It was a significant investment of time and materials, and she was practical about both. But Emma was a different category, had been from the beginning, in ways that Olivia no longer spent energy examining because the examining had become unnecessary. Some things were just true. The gift was a small wooden box, cedar, with a sliding lid and a fitted interior divided into sections by thin cedar strips. Each section was sized for the drawing pencils Emma used, the specific ones, which Olivia had noted and measured one afternoon in the treehouse while Emma drew and wasn't watching. The lid had Emma's initials worked into it in a simple pressed design, the E and H shaped from a single continuous line that looped and crossed itself back. Emma opened it and went very still in the way she went still for things that mattered. She looked at the pencil sections. She looked at the lid. She ran her finger along the pressed initial design, the continuous line. "One line," she said. "One line," Olivia confirmed. Emma looked at her. Something in the look was complicated and young and very old at the same time. The look of a person who has learned that the world takes away and also gives, and who has not finished deciding what to do with that information, but is doing the deciding with all they have. She held the box against her chest the way she'd held the drawing notebook in the living room that first day in November, when she'd decided to give it away. "Thank you," she said. And then, after a pause that had weight, "Olivia." She'd called her Olivia before, but this time it was different. It carried something, an acknowledgement, a claim. The way you say someone's name when you want the name itself to do the work the rest of the sentence can't quite reach. Olivia put her hand briefly on Emma's shoulder. Then she let her go rejoin her school friends, who were currently having a significant disagreement about the correct use of the treehouse that needed mediation. She stood in the garden in the October afternoon and looked at the cedar tree. The treehouse sat in the branches the way it had settled in over the months. Already part of the tree, the way things became part of the things they were built into when the building was done right. The east window was open. Through it, she could see the sky doing the October version of itself. The particular blue that came after the summer haze cleared and before the November gray moved in. The few weeks every year when the Seattle sky was genuinely, uncomplicatedly blue. Adrian came to stand beside her. He did it the way he did everything now, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement. They stood side by side and looked at the treehouse and the tree and the sky through the east window. "She called you Olivia," he said. "She's been calling me Olivia." Not like that. She didn't argue it. He was right, and they both knew it. "What does Dr. Samuel say?" she asked. "About where Emma is." He was quiet for a moment. "She says Emma's not recovering anymore. She's building." He paused. "That's the distinction she drew. Recovery implies getting back to a previous state. Building is forward, different destination." Olivia thought about that, about the difference between restoration and new construction. How in her own field the skills overlapped, but the orientation was opposite. Restoration looked backward, to what had been there, used that knowledge to repair what remained. New construction looked forward, used the bones of the past, but wasn't bounded by them. "She's a builder," Olivia said. "She has been from the start. She built a treehouse with you. She told me where the window should go, and I followed instructions." Adrian half smiled. It was the real version, not the managed one. The one that went all the way to his eyes and didn't perform itself. She'd seen it more often these past months. It was still a somewhat rare occurrence, which made it mean more when it appeared. "The second site opens in January," he said. "I know. I'll be there. And the third in March." Marcus has the timeline. I know Marcus has the timeline. I'm not talking about the timeline. He looked at her. I'm saying, I know how much you're doing. I know you're running the company and learning the field and dealing with the construction managers and coming here on Wednesdays and building tree houses on weekends. And I know it doesn't leave much room, and I know that's the choice you made, and I'm not... He stopped, tried again. I just want you to know that I see it, all of it, not just the parts that are useful to the foundation. She looked at him. I know you see it. I want to make sure you know. Adrian. She said his name the way Emma had said hers, letting it carry the rest. I know. He nodded. He looked back at the treehouse. One of the birthday party children, not Emma, a small red-haired girl who had apparently decided the treehouse disagreement was beneath her, had climbed up the ladder and was sitting in the east window opening, legs dangling, looking out at the garden with the absolute unself-consciousness of a child who had found a good perch. They watched her for a moment. Can I ask you something? Olivia said. Yes, Sarah. She said it carefully, the way she said things she'd thought about before saying. Do you talk about her? With Emma? He was quiet for a moment. More now. We started in the spring. Emma asked questions, and I started answering them. He paused. It's hard, not because I don't want to, because I'm afraid of doing it wrong, of saying things that help me but don't help her. What does Dr. Samuel say? She says the fact that I'm worried about that is itself a form of doing it right. He exhaled, which I find mildly annoying as feedback. Because it doesn't tell you what to do. Because it doesn't tell me what to do. He looked at her. You talked to Emma about Sarah. In the living room, the first day you came to the house. Emma told me. She told me what her mother's voice sounded like, Olivia said. I just asked. What made you ask? She thought about it honestly. Because Emma needed to say it to someone who wasn't inside it the same way you are. I didn't have a relationship with Sarah. I had a single encounter in the worst possible circumstances, but that meant I could hold the conversation without needing anything from it. She paused. Sometimes that's easier. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'm grateful. For that and for... I've told you I'm grateful. I know I've said it. You've said it. I'm going to keep saying it. I know that too. He looked at her. The afternoon light was doing the October thing, angling lower, turning everything slightly golden in the way that couldn't be described without sounding like a greeting card, and happened anyway regardless. The garden smelled like fallen leaves and cedar and the faint salt of the water beyond the fence. I'm not going to make a speech, he said. Good. I'm just going to say, I know it's been complicated. I know I'm complicated. I know the situation was complicated from the beginning in ways that were not... I didn't exactly extend you a simple invitation. No, she agreed. You knocked on my door at 11 o'clock. I did. And you opened it. On a chain. You still opened it. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm saying, whatever this is, whatever we're building, I know it's not simple, and I know you know that, and I know you're in it anyway, and that matters to me, more than I'm probably saying correctly right now. She looked at him for a long moment. The red-haired child in the east window had been joined by Emma, who had climbed up and was now sitting beside the red-haired girl in the window opening, both of them looking out at something in the garden, their heads slightly tilted at the same angle in the unconscious synchrony of children who are comfortable with each other. You're saying it fine, Olivia said. She reached out and put her hand over his briefly. Not a statement, not a declaration. The equivalent of what Emma had done to her in the coffee shop with the drawing. Here, this is for you. I'm giving it over. He turned his hand so that his fingers closed around hers. They stood like that in the October garden while Emma and the red-haired girl watched something below in the grass. A beetle, possibly, or a leaf doing something interesting. And the afternoon light did its thing with the cedar tree and the tree house and the east window that faced the direction where things started. Here is what Olivia Carter knew by October about the way damage worked. She knew it didn't reverse. She knew that the 3 years she'd spent convincing herself she'd failed, in the car, after Tommy, in the small apartment with the overdue bills and the slightly stale gas station bread, those years didn't unknow themselves just because something better had come after. They stayed in the record. They were part of the material. But she also knew, and this was the thing she'd been learning since November, since a hotel alcove and a frightened girl and 7 words she'd inherited from her mother, that damage was not the same as ruin. Damage was the condition of something that had been tested, and tested things, built from honest materials, with the grain running true, held. She thought about this sometimes in the sights. The Tacoma building, the Bellevue one going up, the 9 that were still ahead of her. All those rooms designed to hold frightened people until they remembered they weren't only frightened. She thought about the specific kind of knowledge that had gone into each of them, which was not the knowledge of study, but of experience. Not the knowledge of what safety looked like, but of what it felt like from the inside when you needed it and found it. She thought about what Martinez had said. Moving forward is not the same as going somewhere. And she thought about where she was now, which was somewhere. Not arrived. She was not the kind of person who believed in arriving in the sense of a destination that held still and waited, but going somewhere, with direction, with people beside her. She thought about Tommy. She did this less with the weight of before and more with the fullness of someone who is carrying something precious rather than something heavy. He had loved her in the specific way of someone who saw what she was and didn't want her to be anything else, and that love had not ended with him. It had changed shape. It lived in the box on the shelf, and the photograph on the windowsill, and the flannel shirt, and the way she cooked pasta the way he'd taught her. Present tense? Every time. She thought about Emma's drawing on the windowsill next to Tommy's photograph. 2 kinds of given, side by side. She thought about a sky full of stars over a dark road, and 7 words, and the specific physics of how a thing said in the worst moment can become the anchor for everything after. She thought, the storm always passes. Not because storms don't do damage, not because you come through unchanged or unscathed or any of the things that easy comfort likes to promise, but because the storm is not the whole story and the damage is not the definition, and on the other side of the worst night is still a sky, still the same stars, still, for as long as you're in it, the fact of your own continuing. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. Tia. In the treehouse, Emma was drawing. She drew the garden from above, the cedar tree beneath her, the house beyond it, the water beyond the house. She drew it the way she drew everything, with more stars than were strictly visible in the afternoon sky, because she had decided, somewhere in the months of recovery that were now months of building, that the stars were always there, whether you could see them or not, and she preferred to draw what was true over what was only visible. She drew 2 figures in the garden below. Small, the way figures are small when you're looking down at them from height. One shorter, one taller, standing close. She looked at it for a moment. Then she added something she hadn't planned to add, which was a line between the 2 figures. Just a line, not elaborate, not labeled. A connection, the kind of thing that didn't need explanation to be understood. She put the drawing in the cedar box Olivia had made, in the section sized for the papers she kept, and she slid the lid closed. Through the east window, the October sky was doing what October skies did in Seattle, trying, in the few hours before the clouds came back, to be exactly itself. Blue, specific, brief. Emma looked at it for a long time. Then she climbed down the ladder, crossed the garden in the afternoon light, and went inside where the people she loved were, which was where she was going now, which was where she intended to stay.